Welcome, traveler, to AI Lovecraft After Dark, a journey beyond the fragile veil of reality, where shadows twist, sanity frays, and forgotten horrors slumber beneath starlit skies. Tonight, let artificial intelligence be your guide, as it summons tales of eldritch dread, ancient mysteries, and cosmic horror born from the abyssal realms of imagination itself. Draw your curtains, dim your lights, and prepare to wander through the labyrinthine nightmares conjured in the spirit of H.P. Lovecraft. For the next 3 hours, abandon hope for comfort or understanding. Here in the darkness, the unknown whispers, and it is hungry. If you enjoy the following stories, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment to let me know what you think. Now let's get into the first story. Beneath Blackwood. I arrived in the isolated village of Blackwood on a warm autumn afternoon, seeking refuge from the clamor of modern life. The hamlet was tucked away in a forgotten corner of New England, a place seemingly untouched by time. Weathered farmhouses and an antiquated church spire rose among ancient elms and maples, all bathed in the golden light of dusk. Locals nodded politely as I drove past, their faces lined with age and something else I could not name. At the time, I thought it simple quaintness, never suspecting the eldritch secrets lurking beneath Blackwood's rustic charm. My new home was a centuries-old farmhouse inherited from a distant relative, a building sagging with age yet sturdy against the elements. Its walls of timber and stone bore the scars of time, moss-cloaked shingles, and a doorstep etched with strange symbols that I dismissed as decorative flourishes of some antiquarian whim. The air carried a peculiar hush. Even in the age of buzzing electronics, there was scant cell reception and an unnatural stillness after sundown. On my first night, as I settled by oil lamplight, for the old wiring was prone to outages, I felt a vague unease, a sense that unseen eyes watched from the dark woods encircling the property. That first night, near midnight, I was roused from an uneasy slumber by a distant sound drifting through my open window. The moon, a gibbous orb, hung low above the tree line, casting distorted silver shadows across the yard. On the wind came a faint melody of indeterminate notes, a series of low chants or perhaps the far-off murmuring of voices. I strained to listen, telling myself it must be the rustle of breeze through the pines, or some nocturnal animal's cry. Yet an uncanny pattern in the sound stirred the hairs on my neck. It felt intentional, like a hymn to something ancient in the darkness. The next day I ventured into the village to stock up on provisions at the tiny general store. In the light of morning, my nocturnal fright seemed almost foolish, yet I couldn't shake it from my mind. I mentioned the sounds in passing to the shopkeeper, a gaunt man with wispy white hair. He offered a perfunctory smile that did not reach his eyes and said, "Ah, probably just the wind in the hollows or coyotes out by the ridge. Sound carries oddly in these woods." An old woman perusing canned goods nearby muttered something under her breath at this, and the storekeeper shot her a warning glance. I caught only a fragment of her words, something about old voices in the pines, before an awkward silence fell. Sensing their reticence, I let the matter drop, but a prickle of unease remained. That afternoon, determined to shake off the lingering disquiet, I busied myself sorting through the clutter left in the farmhouse by my late relative. In the attic, amid dust and cobwebs, I discovered a heavy oak chest secured by a rusty lock. After some effort, the lock gave way, revealing a trove of moldering papers and a large leather-bound volume. A faint smell of decay and old ink wafted out. Among the papers was a handwritten journal, its ink faded and pages brittle. My heart quickened as I recognized the name on the inside cover. It was the diary of Charles Wentworth, my eccentric great-uncle from whom I'd inherited the property. Tucked beneath the diary was an even older manuscript, a tome whose title, embossed in peeling gilt, read in French, Cults of the Dark Woods. The very touch of its age-stiffened leather sent a shiver through me, as if I had unearthed something that had lain hidden for eons. As twilight deepened, I pored over Charles's diary by the flicker of a kerosene lamp. The entries began innocuously enough, notes on the weather and the challenges of maintaining the old house, but soon took a darker turn. In shaky script, he described hearing the same disembodied chants that had troubled my own sleep. One entry read, October 12th, 1982, awoken again by those distant drums and voices under the gibbous moon. This is no dream. The townsfolk feign ignorance, but I see knowing fear in their eyes. Another entry months later was more alarming. Strange symbols found carved on my door and on trees at the forest's edge. They resemble a twisted branch or horned figure. I dare not erase them for fear of what they portend. Old Meyer hinted these marks are to ward off something, or to invite it. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, each filled with mounting paranoia and fear. The further I read, the more Charles's neat penmanship devolved into frantic scrawl. He recounted a local legend of an ancient cult dating back to the village's founding in the late 17th century. Blackwood, it seemed, was settled not just by pious farmers, but by a schismatic sect seeking to worship older, darker gods far from prying eyes. They spoke of an entity known in hushed whispers as the Black Goat of the Woods with 1,000 young. In a later entry, Charles wrote, I have cross-referenced the town's lore with passages from the forbidden tome I found hidden in the church ruins. The name Shub-Nigrath appears, an eldritch deity of unholy fertility in the forest. Could the quaint harvest festival here be a front for blasphemous rites honoring this obscenity? I felt a chill at that name, dimly recognizing it from myth. Shub-Nigrath, a monstrous being in obscure occult texts, a deity of primordial woods and foul fertility. Charles's final entries were barely legible, describing a plan to uncover the cult's gathering place and confront the truth. The diary ended abruptly on a note of terror. They know that I know. I fear I am being watched. The chanting grows louder each night. If I disappear, let it be known that I succumb to the black wood. The line trailed off in a jagged stroke of ink. I sat back, heart pounding as the candle guttered low. The revelations in my great-uncle's diary left me reeling. Outside, night had fallen completely, and a heavy silence pressed against the walls of the farmhouse. My hands were shaking and my breath came in quick, shallow bursts. Was I truly living in the midst of an ongoing occult conspiracy? It seemed unfathomable, yet too many parallels existed between Charles's accounts and my own experiences. I resolved that at first light I would drive to the nearest town with a police station and show them this diary, as evidence that something was deeply amiss in Blackwood. Before sleeping, I double-checked the door locks and bolted the shutters. The old house creaked around me as if troubled by the night's secrets. My cell phone had no signal here, as usual, and the landline produced nothing but static when I tried it. Isolated and anxious, I retreated to the bedroom with Charles's diary under my pillow, a strange talisman of truth in a village of lies. It took a long while to fall asleep. That night I tumbled into a fitful sleep and into nightmares of dreadful clarity. I dreamed I was wandering through the black woods under the bloated moon, drawn by distant drums I could not resist. The trees towered above me, twisted into almost human shapes, their bare branches like contorted arms beckoning me onward. Presently I came to a clearing deep in the forest where giant, moss-covered stones stood arranged in a ring, cyclopean and ancient. No human hands could have raised them. A crowd of figures in homespun robes stood assembled, their faces hidden by hoods as they swayed and chanted in unison, a cacophonous litany that resonated with indescribable antiquity. Yah! Shub-Nigrath, Black Goat of the Woods, accept our offering, the congregation howled in unison. On a crude stone altar at the center lay a struggling figure. I could not tell if it was human or animal in that wretched light, surrounded by strange sigils that glowed its sickly, pallid hue. The chanting rose to a frenzied pitch as a horrific shape began to coalesce above the altar, a shadowy, towering entity with grasping appendages and a single, baleful eye glaring from the darkness. It was an abomination of swirling shadow and flesh, part hooved beast and part writhing tentacle, yet ultimately something unnameable and utterly blasphemous to behold. In the dream, I was paralyzed, forced to witness the unspeakable rite. The monstrous eye turned toward me as if aware of my presence, flooding my mind with a wave of primordial terror. I wanted to scream or flee, but could not move. At that moment, the robed villagers all at once craned their heads in my direction, though their hoods still shrouded their faces. I felt dozens of unseen eyes upon me. In a ragged chorus they bellowed, "Join us," in voices distorted and inhuman. With that, the giant black thing surged forward with impossible speed, its tendrils reaching out to snare me. I jolted awake with a cry, drenched in sweat and gasping as if I had been submerged in ice water. I did not sleep again that night. For hours I sat in the armchair by the window, clutching a fireplace poker with white-knuckled hands, jumping at every rustle or creak. At times I thought I heard soft footsteps on the porch, or the faintest whisper of that accursed chant carried on the breeze. I dared not investigate in the darkness. Only with the gray light of dawn did I finally unbar the door and step outside, exhausted and shaken. There on the wooden door I found a fresh carving that had not been there the day before, a crudely etched sigil of a horn twisting shape. The grooves were stained dark as if traced with blood. The sight of it made me recoil. Someone or something had been at my door in the night as I fitfully dreamed of their horrid congregation. The realization that my presence was known to them, that I was being directly targeted, sent a bolt of icy dread through my heart. It was a warning, or perhaps a mark. In panic, I resolved to flee Blackwood immediately and get help. I hastily stuffed Charles's diary and the strange tome in my satchel as proof of the cult's existence. When I reached my old pickup truck, however, I found the tires slashed and a tangle of oily innards protruding from the hood, wires and tubes viciously torn out. They had sabotaged my only vehicle. Heart-pounding, I started down the gravel road on foot, aiming to put as much distance between me and this accursed village as possible. The morning fog clung to the trees, and beyond the first bend I spotted two figures in the haze, standing motionless among the pines. They were watching me. Whether they were members of the cult or just curious locals, I could not tell. But fear seized me. I realized how easily I could be waylaid on the lonely road. Reluctantly, I retreated back to the farmhouse, mind racing for another plan. Not long after, as afternoon light slanted wanly through the kitchen window, I heard a knock at the door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Through the peephole, I saw the stooped figure of Mr. Miller, the storekeeper I'd met the day before. For a moment, I considered not answering, but he likely knew I was home. Composing myself, I opened the door a crack. "Good day to you," Mr. Miller said with a thin smile. In his hands, he held a covered basket from which the aroma of fresh-baked bread wafted, incongruously comforting. "Thought I'd drop by to see how you're settling in. Brought you a little something from the missus." I forced a polite reply and unbolted the door fully, wary yet unwilling to betray panic. Miller stepped in uninvited, setting the basket on my table. His pale eyes drifted to the scratched symbol still visible on the door. "Shame about the vandalism," he murmured. "We don't usually have such troubles here. Likely some hooligan youngsters." I said nothing, my mouth dry. After an awkward pause, he cleared his throat. "I also came to remind you, sir, tonight's our annual harvest gathering down by the old oak grove. We'd be pleased to have you join us. Being new in town and all, it's a fine way to meet everyone proper." He smiled again, but there was something in his voice, a forced geniality. His fingers drummed absently on the table, and I noticed one of his nails was dark, with what looked like dried blood. I'm not sure I'll be up to it," I stammered, my eyes fixed on the stained nail and the basket he'd brought, a peculiar communion of hospitality and menace. I didn't sleep well." Mr. Miller's expression flickered, the smile fading for just a heartbeat. "I understand. New surroundings can be unsettling." He stepped a bit closer. "Still, it would mean a lot to the community if you come. We're a close-knit folk here. Outsiders, well, we like to make them feel welcome." There was a subtle emphasis on the word outsiders that made it sound almost like sacrifice to my rattled mind. I swallowed hard and forced a nod. He patted my shoulder with a cold, papery hand. "Splendid. See you around 8 then. Down the path into the woods behind your property. You'll see the bonfire. Can't miss it." With that, Mr. Miller tipped his hat and departed, leaving the bread basket on my table. My hands were trembling uncontrollably now. The harvest gathering in the oak grove. There was no doubt this was the very congregation I had dreamed of. The cult's ritual under a moonlit sky, and they expected me to attend. As evening drew on, I wrestled with what to do. Clearly, the entire community was involved in this monstrous cult. If I tried to hide in the house, they would likely come for me with numbers. If I went to their gathering, I feared I would become their next offering. Neither option boded well, yet I had to do something. My eyes fell on an old hunting rifle mounted above the hearth, Charles's rifle, left to gather dust. I had never fired a gun at a living thing, but at that moment I felt a grim resolve. With trembling hands, I took it down and checked that it was loaded, stuffing a few extra cartridges into my coat pocket. It was a feeble hope of protection, but better than going into the unknown utterly unarmed. The hours until nightfall crept by agonizingly slow. Through my windows I saw silhouettes in the distance, villagers carrying torches or lanterns toward the woods. Dark shapes bobbing through the twilight. They were preparing. When the time came, I steeled myself and left the house, following a narrow path behind the barn that led into the forest, as Mr. Miller had indicated. The air was deathly still, and the only light came from my flashlight and a distant reddish glow deeper in the woods. Every crunch of leaves under my feet made me flinch. My heart thudded so loudly I wondered if they could hear it in the silent trees. Near the grove I extinguished my flashlight and proceeded under the pallid moonlight filtering through the gnarled branches. Hiding behind the bole of a massive oak, I peered ahead. The scene before me was both terrifying and eerily familiar, as if my nightmare had stepped from my mind into reality. In a clearing ringed by ancient standing stones, a great bonfire blazed, casting wild, flickering light on the gathering. A large number of townsfolk stood in a circle. Many wore rough-spun robes or black coats, forming a sea of indistinct figures mumbling in unison. The tall stones around them were indeed like those in my dream, monolithic and weathered, thrusting up from the earth like the fingers of some primordial giant. On a stone altar before the fire lay a bound figure, perhaps a person, though mercifully, distance and dancing shadows obscured the details. A deep, sonorous voice intoned words in Latin or some older tongue. The speaker was an imposing figure in a hooded cloak, standing atop a stone dais, draped with animal skins. He raised his arms high, and the crowd responded with a unanimous droning chant. Yah, Shub-Nigrath! Yah, Shub-Nigrath! Their voices were fervent and reverential, blending into a singular drone that made the night air vibrate. A wave of nausea washed over me as I realized this was no harmless folk ritual. It was a genuine invocation to summon an unholy presence. To my horror, 2 members of the congregation stepped forward to the altar and hoisted up the limp victim. In the firelight, I glimpsed a pale face. Perhaps the poor soul was only unconscious or drugged. The robed leader produced a long, ceremonial knife that glinted in the fire glow. At a shouted command, the assembly fell silent. A moment later, the knife plunged downward. Even over the crackle of the flames, I heard a wet, sickening slice and the gurgling final cry of the sacrifice. I stifled a shout of revulsion as hot blood cascaded over the altar and pooled at the base of the stones. The blood seemed to soak into the earth itself as though the thirsty soil drank the offering. An unnatural hush fell. The fire flickered wildly, its flames guttering from orange to an eerie greenish hue. The chanting resumed, faster and more urgent, rising to a loathsome crescendo as the air above the altar began to shimmer, as if reality itself were twisting. A foul odor permeated the clearing, an overpowering stench of decay and ozone that turned my stomach. What happened next defies full description, but I must try. As the congregation moaned and swayed in ecstasy, something began to manifest in the center of that stone ring. From the darkness beyond the firelight, a colossal shadow oozed forward. It was as if the void between the stars had taken shape, an amorphous mass of darkness, given living form. I saw a massive, roiling form, blacker than the blackest night, sprouting tendrils or roots that writhed and curled into the soil. Glints of wetness along its surface hinted at a skin or hide slick with a viscous ichor. Among the twisting appendages, I caught glimpses of hooves stamping the earth and misshapen mouths opening and closing soundlessly. My mind reeled at the sight of this blasphemy-made flesh. It was Shub-Nigrath. It had to be. The very deity they had invoked, the hideous black goat of the woods, come to collect its due. Its form was protean and hideously abnormal, a nightmare of horns, squamous limbs, and gaping maws, a thing so loathsome it sickened both heart and soul. I felt madness scratching at the edges of my consciousness as I gazed upon that which should not be. I must have made some involuntary sound, perhaps a whimper or gasp, for suddenly the monstrous entity reared, what might have been its head turning in my direction. In that instant, a dozen cultists also wheeled toward the tree line where I hid. "There! Someone is there!" An unmistakably human voice cried out. My blood ran cold. The next moment, chaos erupted. I bolted from behind the tree and ran blindly into the woods, adrenaline and terror lending me speed. A cacophony of shouts rose behind me as the congregation gave chase. Twigs snapped and branches whipped at my face as several figures fanned out in pursuit. The beam of a flashlight danced erratically through the trunks to my right, someone trying to cut me off. I veered left, lungs burning. In desperation, I turned and fired the rifle behind me. The gun's roar shattered the night, and briefly the woods were lit by the muzzle flash. I heard a yelp of pain. Perhaps one of them had been hit, or at least startled. I plunged onward, but in my panic and the darkness, I lost the narrow path. Gnarled roots snaked under the leaf litter, catching at my feet. Suddenly my boot snagged on something and I pitched forward down a small embankment. The rifle flew from my grip as I tumbled and landed hard, pain jolting up my leg. Dazed and panting, I clawed at the damp earth, trying to rise. Before I could scramble to my feet, strong arms seized me from behind. Rough hands yanked me upright. I found myself surrounded by several villagers, faces I recognized from town, now twisted with zeal and fury. They wrenched my arms behind me, binding my wrists with coarse rope. I thrashed and screamed, but a clammy palm clapped over my mouth. My rifle was gone. I was helpless. They half dragged, half carried me back toward the firelit grove. Despite my frantic kicks and muffled cries, I could not break free of their iron grips. As we emerged into the clearing, the crowd parted to let us through. I saw that the ritual had been momentarily interrupted. The villagers stood in a loose ring, eyes shining in the firelight as they regarded me. The altar was slick with gore where the earlier victim's body lay slumped, a dark heap on the blood-stained stone. And looming just beyond, partly obscured by shadow, was the thing they had summoned, the monstrous presence, swaying like a colossal tree of flesh and shadow. Its indistinct form pulsed and quivered at the edge of vision, as if not fully there, or as if my mind refused to fully register it. A collective murmur rose from the assembly as I was thrust forward, a mixture of triumph and anticipation. The high priest stepped down from his dais to approach me, and as he drew near, he pushed back his hood. I stared in horrified recognition at the face revealed. It was Mr. Miller. The amiable old shopkeeper's features were alight with an unholy zeal, transformed by the flickering fire into the visage of a stranger. He looked upon me with a curious pity. "You should not have meddled, son," Mr. Miller said softly, almost genially. "We could have welcomed you among us in time. Now," he glanced up at the towering shadow of Shub-Nigrath looming behind the altar, "the black goat hungers, and we have a guest to sate." I tried to scream as they forced me down onto the altar slab, right atop the still warm remains of the prior victim. The coppery smell of blood was overpowering. Miller, or the thing wearing Miller's face, loomed above me, raising the sacrificial dagger high. Its blade was slick with gore, shining red in the firelight. I stared up in terror at the dagger poised to fall and at the shifting darkness of the entity beyond. Time seemed to slow to a crawl in that ghastly moment. The gigantic shadow thing loomed closer, its foul stench washing over me like an open grave. I felt one of its tendrils brush against my cheek, an icy slug-like touch that sent jolts of agony and ecstasy through my nerves. My vision swam as an alien presence slithered into my mind, an inundation of chaotic images and emotions not my own. I believe I screamed, but I no longer truly knew what was happening. There was only pain and horror, and a sense of something irrevocable snapping inside me as my consciousness was engulfed by that inhuman will. I mercifully remember nothing more of that night. I awoke days later in a hospital bed in a town some 50 miles from Blackwood, so I was told. Weak sunlight filtered through sterile white curtains. An officious man in a sheriff's uniform stood at the foot of my bed, speaking in a low voice to a doctor. When they noticed I had come to, they gently began to question me. It seems I had been found at dawn, wandering along a back road muttering to myself, spattered with blood and half delirious. A passing truck driver nearly hit me, and seeing my condition took me straight to the hospital. I had no memory of how I escaped that final moment at the altar, nor of what became of the cultists or their hideous god. The wounds on my body spoke to some nightmare reality. I was covered in scratches and bruises, and on my chest was a peculiar mark, a spiral burn or scar as if seared by a brand not entirely of this world. Clutched in my hands was Charles's diary, miraculously intact save for a few singed pages. When I was lucid enough to give a statement, a police unit was dispatched to investigate Blackwood. They found the village eerily quiet and seemingly deserted. Mr. Miller's store was closed, his house empty, as were the homes of many other residents. It was as if the entire population had fled. At the oak grove in the woods, the officers reported signs of a bonfire and what appeared to be the charred remains of animals, goats, and deer perhaps, likely evidence of ritual sacrifices. The standing stones I had described were not found. In their place were deep indentations in the soil, as if great weights had recently pressed there before vanishing. No human bodies were recovered. In the official report, Blackwood was labeled as a site of illegal occult activity. The authorities assumed that the inhabitants had belonged to a dangerous cult, and spooked by the narrow escape of their intended victim, myself, they had dismantled their campsite and fled into the night. Warrants were issued, a manhunt launched, but I have little hope any of them will be found. We are dealing with more than ordinary criminals. They tell me I am lucky to be alive. I write these words from a quiet room in a sanitarium, where the doctors insist I rest and recover from my ordeal. Lucky? Perhaps. Yet I do not feel safe. Each night sleep eludes me, not only because of the nightmares that inevitably come, but because of a strange certainty that something still watches me from the shadows. In the deepest hours I still hear the distant echo of that infernal chant. "Yah! Shub-Nigrath!" whispered in the rustling leaves outside my window. When I manage to sleep, I dream of that towering silhouette with its burning red eye, lurking just beyond the reach of light. The doctors assure me it's all hallucination, trauma-born. They say the human mind cannot withstand such horrors without breaking, and perhaps they are right. I nod and pretend to agree with their rational explanations for the scars on my body and the scars on my mind. Yet I know what I witnessed was hideously real. An ancient evil was awakened in Blackwood, if only for that one terrible night, and I fear it has not been fully put to rest. The cult may have scattered, but their blasphemous work was done. Some door was opened, if only a crack, and something unspeakable slithered through. Even far from that doomed village, I do not feel beyond its reach. On lonely evenings, I catch myself listening for the faint beat of drums, or a distant flute on the wind, dreading that it may not be imagination. I pray that these are merely the phantoms of a traumatized mind and not a summons, but in my heart I remain braced for the day I know may come, when I hear once more the dreadful piping from the woods and the loathsome braying of Shub-Nigrath's 1,000 young. When that day arrives, I wonder if I will have the strength to resist, or if I will walk willingly into those woods, drawn by the same ancient call that lured the villagers of Blackwood to their doom. I write this account as both catharsis and warning. There are places in this world hidden beneath a veneer of quaint innocence, where nameless horrors still hold sway. Places like Blackwood, where a simple outsider like myself can stumble upon abominations that shatter sanity and forever taint the soul. I escaped physically, yes, but a part of me will forever remain in those cursed woods, bound to the eldritch darkness that dwells beneath Blackwood. The fourth revelation of the Necronomicon. In the bleak autumn of 1925, when Arkham's fog-choked streets seemed to writhe with secrets older than the earth, I received a summons that would hurl me into a maelstrom of cosmic dread. The letter, its parchment brittle and steeped in a charnel reek, bore the faltering script of Dr. Henry Armitage, curator of Miskatonic University's antiquarian vaults. Its words, though few, carried a venom that pierced my soul. Ezekiel, your reckless pursuits of the forbidden has marked you as one who might endure the truths we have uncovered. A lost chapter of the Necronomicon has surfaced, whispering of a fourth revelation, a secret so monstrous that even Al-Azred, the mad Arab, shrouded it in terror. Come to Arkham at once. The translation is unfinished, and I dread what we may invoke. the Necronomicon, that accursed grimoire of Abdul-Alazred, had long tormented my studies. Its pages drenched in the lore of the outer gods, Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, Yog-Sothoth, the key and the gate, and Azathoth, whose idiot piping sustains the cosmos, were a lure to scholars like myself, who courted madness for glimpses of ultimate truth. Yet this fourth revelation was a shadow beyond the tome's darkest depths. My curiosity, that fatal flaw, drove me to Arkham's mist-shrouded heart. The town lay under a sickly pall, its gabled roofs and twisted alleys bathed in a twilight that seemed to pulse with malice. Miskatonic University's library, a gothic monolith of lichen-crusted stone, loomed like a sepulchre, its arched windows glinting in an unnatural sheen. Armitage met me in a subterranean chamber, its air thick with the must of ancient tomes and a fouler stench, like ozone laced with decay. His face was haggard, his eyes darting as though hunted by unseen horrors. On a table strewn with crumbling manuscripts lay the newfound chapter, a single parchment, its edges blackened as if scorched by a starless void. Alazred's script, Arabic entwined with glyphs that squirmed with malevolent intent, seemed to writhe under scrutiny. The title, inked in crimson that glistened wetly, read, "The Fourth Revelation of Izathar Null." "It was unearthed in a Damascus crypt," Armitage rasped, his voice a brittle whisper, "sealed in a leaden casket bound with wards that crumbled to ash at a touch. The chapter speaks of a war, a conflict before the cosmos, waged by beings beyond even the outer gods, entities whose mere existence shatters reality." I leaned closer, the parchment's odor a miasma of wrought and alien metal, stinging my senses. The phrase, id quod null, a term Alazred used in place of the dreaded name, recurred like a dirge, each repetition tightening a noose around my heart. Armitage's trembling finger traced a passage. "Our reality is a mistake, a flaw born of this primordial strife. The universe, the stars, humanity, all are an unintended wound. Izathar Null was forged to heal it, to unmake the error of existence." I recoiled, my mind buckling. Unmake? What could wield such power? And why has it not acted? Armitage's eyes blazed with feverish intensity. "It slumbers, bound by chains woven in before. The text warns it was meant to wake eons ago. But something, perhaps the war's echoes, or the outer god's schemes, thwarted its purpose. Yet the fourth revelation is clear. When Izathar Null stirs, it will erase all that is flawed, all that is." We began our translation that night, huddled beneath the chamber's vaulted ceiling, where shadows clung like spectral webs. The work was a descent into madness. The glyphs shifted under scrutiny, forming patterns that seared my vision. Each deciphered line clawed at my sanity, unveiling a conflict beyond time's grasp. Alazred described a battlefield of unbeing, where entities without form or name tore at the fabric of the unmade. From their clash, reality spilled forth, not by design but as a cosmic accident, a festering wound that birthed stars, worlds, and the frail spark of life. One passage burned into my soul, read, "In the before, when no light burned and no god stirred, the great contention raged. Beings beyond name rent the unmade, and from their wounds sprang the flaw, the cosmos, a tapestry woven in error. Izathar Null was forged to mend this fault, to unravel the stars and still the clamor of existence. Yet it sleeps, its purpose thwarted by forces unseen. Woe to the seeker who utters its name, for its gaze will unmake all that is not perfection." The library grew hostile as we labored. The air thickened, heavy with an electric hum that gnawed at my nerves. Shadows writhed at the chamber's edges, forming angular shapes, polyhedral, impossible, that vanished when I turned. Armitage grew skeletal, his mutterings incoherent. "The flaw, it sees." I too felt the text's malevolence, as though it probed my mind, seeking cracks to widen. At night I dreamt of a lightless void, where Izathar Null stirred, a formless intellect, not a being but a principle, weighing the universe and finding it wanting. Its scrutiny was a cold blade, slicing through the illusion of existence. On the 12th night we reached the final passage, incomplete and jagged, as if Alazred had fled his quill in terror. Izathar Null wakes when the flaw is named. Its stirring is not birth, but remembrance, for it knows all that should not be. Utter its name and the stars will gutter. Seek its form and the void will answer. It waits in the place where no light falls, where the before and the now are one. To know the fourth revelation is to invite its gaze, and none may withstand. The text broke off in frantic scratches, the parchment scored as if clawed by a desperate hand. Armitage collapsed, whispering, "We've named it by seeking it." The hum surged, a deafening drone that shook the chamber's stones. The parchment glowed, its glyphs writhing like serpents, and the air grew viscous as though reality itself recoiled. I resolved to abandon the work, to seal the chapter away and flee Arkham's cursed streets. But as I gathered the manuscripts, the shadows coalesced, forming a lattice of impossible angles that pulsed in time with the hum. I fled to my lodgings, the chapter locked in a steel case, but the drone pursued me, seeping into my dreams. The lightless void returned, and Izathar Null grew clearer, a force of unmaking, its presence a weight that crushed hope and reason. Weeks bled into a haze of dread. I became a recluse, haunted by a truth I could not unlearn. The fourth revelation was a wound in reality, a secret that invited annihilation. I burned Armitage's notes, but the chapter defied destruction. Flames recoiled and water left it pristine. In desperation, I buried it beneath a gnarled oak on Arkham's outskirts, its roots twisted like grasping claws, yet the hum persisted, growing louder, as though the thing it heralded drew near. One night, driven to the brink, I returned to the library, seeking solace in the Necronomicon's other chapters. In a forgotten alcove, I found Armitage's remains, a shriveled husk, his face a rictus of terror, his eyes milky voids. Scratched into the floor were the words, "It comes, it unmakes." Behind him lay a sketch, a lightless void, and within it a suggestion of something vast, formless, inevitable, its edges bleeding into nothingness. I fled Arkham that night, but no distance dulls the hum. It is with me always, a reminder of the truth I cannot escape. Izathar Null is no god, no demon, but a force older than time, a principle that unravels the mistake of reality. In my dreams, I see it seeping into the world, extinguishing stars, unraveling time itself. The fourth revelation is its herald, and I, fool that I am, have spoken its name by seeking it. I write this as a warning, though I fear it is too late. The hum grows louder, and the shadows tighten their grip. If you find this account, burn it. If you hear of the fourth revelation, turn away. Do not seek the chapter. Do not utter the name, for Izathar Null is waking, and when it does, there will be no gods, no stars, no life, only the silence of a cosmos undone. The Howl of the Hollow Ones. It was in the autumn of 1929, amid the dust-choked stacks of Miskatonic University's hoary archives, that I first stumbled upon the name Wrexham Hollow. The reference was a mere footnote, scrawled in a crumbling monograph on New England's esoteric folklore. Its ink faded to the hue of dried blood. The passage spoke cryptically of a village sealed by time and soothed by the voices of the moon. A phrase so poetic yet so unsettling that it lodged in my mind like a splinter. As an anthropologist, I was accustomed to chasing such fragments of strangeness, but what drove me to Wrexham Hollow was not academic zeal. It was the whispered reports. 8 souls had vanished from the village in as many months, their disappearances eerily synchronized with the full moon zenith. The villagers, it was said, called these lost ones the Hollow Ones. I arrived in Wrexham Hollow on a bleak December evening when the sky was a bruise and the air carried the metallic tang of impending snow. The Hollow, as its denizens named it, lay cradled in a valley so unnaturally still that it seemed the world held its breath. The houses, gambrel-roofed relics of a bygone century, sagged under the weight of neglect, their timbers blackened as if scorched by some unseen flame. Warped glass panes flickered with faint, sickly light, and the chimneys exhaled thin tendrils of smoke that curled upward like the sighs of a dreamer trapped in restless slumber. The streets were unpaved, little more than ruts of frozen mud, and the silence was so profound that my footsteps seemed an affront to the village's somnolent malaise. The inhabitants of Wrexham Hollow greeted me with neither warmth nor hostility, but with a vacant, staring silence that chilled me more than the winter wind. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes sunken into sockets so deep they seemed to peer inward, as if beholding some private abyss. I sought out the village headman, a skeletal figure named Obed Toller, whose presence was as disquieting as the hollow itself. His skin was parchment thin, stretched taut over bones that seemed too sharp, too angular for a mortal frame. He spoke in a whisper as though fearful of rousing something vast and slumbering beneath the earth. "You come for the hollowed?" he rasped, his voice a dry rustle like dead leaves. "Best you leave 'fore the next moon sings. Ain't no salvation in them what's been called back." "Called back from where?" I pressed, though a primal instinct warned me against the answer. Toller's eyes, pale as frost, flickered with something akin to pity, or perhaps contempt. "You ain't meant to know, nor to see." I dismissed his words as the superstition of an insular folk, as all men of reason must when first confronted with the inexplicable. Yet even then I felt the weight of his warning, like a stone sinking into the depths of my soul. I took lodging in the Hollow's Soul Inn, a squat, decrepit edifice that seemed to crouch against the earth, its walls encrusted with a greenish fungal growth that glistened wetly in the lamplight. The innkeeper was a girl of perhaps 16, pale and silent, who answered to the name May. Her eyes were unnaturally wide, unblinking, and her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she feared to disturb the air itself. She spoke not a word, merely gestured to a room on the second floor, its door sagging on rusted hinges. The room was a study in decay, the walls wept with damp, staining the peeling wallpaper with patterns that seemed, in the flickering candlelight, to writhe like veins. The bed was a moldering heap of straw and coarse linen, and the single window was so encrusted with grime that it admitted only a faint, grayish glow. At night the cold was not merely physical but invasive, seeping into my bones as if the room itself sought to claim me. Worse still were the sounds, low, guttural groans that rose from beneath the floorboards. Not the creak of settling wood or the gurgle of pipes, but something organic, stifled, and hideously patient. I told myself it was the wind or the house's ancient frame, but sleep came fitfully, haunted by the sense that I was not alone. By day I scoured the hollow for traces of the vanished. Their names were not recorded, no gravestones marked their absence, no memorials honored their lives. The villagers spoke of them only in euphemisms. They had hollowed out or gone to their calling. They were not dead, it seemed, but gone, a distinction that filled me with an unnameable dread. Obed Toller, when pressed, offered only cryptic mutterings. "They ain't lost. They's found, by what's been waitin'." My search led me to the village's church, if such a term could apply to the half-ruined structure that squatted at the hollow's heart. Its steeple had long since collapsed, and its walls were choked with thorny brambles that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of mildew and something sharper, like rusted iron. The pews were rotted to splinters, and the altar was a slab of uneven stone, stained with dark, irregular patches that no amount of rational thought could attribute to natural causes. It was here in a locked chest hidden beneath a pile of moldering hymnals that I found the first true clue to Wrexham Hollow's secret. The chest contained ledgers, their leather bindings brittle as old bone, inscribed with records dating back to the village's founding in 1693. These were not the usual chronicles of baptisms or marriages, but a litany of something called the calling. One entry, written in a spidery hand that seemed to claw at the page, read, "When the moon is full and hungers for reflection, they shall walk anew, for the seed of the star abides in the marrow of our kind. Hollow be the flesh that once was whole, and whole be the hunger that drives them home." The words burned themselves into my mind, each syllable a weight upon my thoughts. As I transcribed the pages into my notebook, a dull ache began to pulse behind my eyes, as if my very brain rebelled against the knowledge. I left the church with a sense of violation, as though I had trespassed not merely upon sacred ground, but upon the boundary of something far older and far less forgiving. The transformation, when it came, was not heralded by thunder or cataclysm, but by a subtle, insidious shift in the fabric of the hollow. It was the eve of the next full moon, and the village seemed to hold its breath, its silence now a palpable thing, heavy with anticipation. I sat in my room, my notes spread before me, when the first howl pierced the night. It was no sound of beast or man, but something deeper, older, a tremor that seemed to rise from the earth itself, as if the bones of the world were groaning in unison. The howl grew, joined by others, until the air was thick with a chorus of shrill, unclean cries, monstrously human in cadence, yet utterly devoid of warmth or reason. The villagers I saw through my window had barred their doors and shuttered their windows, their faces pale and drawn as they avoided the sky. No one spoke, no one looked at the moon. I did. It hung above the hollow like a cyclopean eye, swollen and bloodless, its light not silver but a sickly, phosphorescent white that seemed to writhe upon the snow. Beneath its gaze I saw them, the hollow ones. They emerged from the encircling woods, shambling figures that were human in silhouette, but grotesquely altered, as if viewed through the distorting lens of a nightmare. Their limbs were too long, too thin, bending at angles that mocked anatomy. Their faces, God help me, were eyeless, the sockets gaping voids that seemed to drink the moonlight. Their skin was translucent, stretched taut over frames that pulsed with an inner motion, as if worms or worse writhed beneath the surface. They had no mouths, yet from some unseen orifice came the howls. Sounds that were not merely heard, but felt, fraying the edges of my sanity with each ululating note. I watched transfixed as they moved through the village, not walking but gliding, their motions jerky and unnatural, like puppets jerked by unseen strings. They did not touch the houses, nor did they acknowledge the village's terror. But one paused, its faceless head turning slowly toward my window, and in that moment, I felt a presence, not in the creature, but through it, as if something vast and distant gazed upon me through those hollow sockets. I fled to my bed, barricading the door with a chair, though I knew no lock could bar what I had seen. The howls continued until dawn, when they ceased as abruptly as they had begun. When I ventured outside, the snow was pristine, unmarred by tracks, and the villagers resumed their silent routines as if nothing had occurred. I confronted Obed Toller, my voice trembling with rage and fear. "You've seen what ain't yours to see," he said, his smile a rictus of bone and shadow. "They ain't beasts, they're vessels." "For what?" I demanded, my hands clenched to still their shaking. "For what made us," he replied, and turned away. The true horror of Wrexham Hollow revealed itself not in the howls or the hollow ones, but in the words of a man long dead. That night, driven by a dream of faceless children dancing in a ring of bone, I paced the inn's creaking floorboards until I noticed a loose plank in the corner of my room. Beneath it was a crawl space, dank and foul, its walls glistening with an oily sheen. There, in a rusted tin box, I found the diaries of Jonah Wrexham, the village's founder. The diaries were a descent into madness, or perhaps a revelation too vast for a mortal mind to bear. Jonah wrote of a star-born affinity, a pact forged in the Hollow's infancy with entities not of this world, beings who existed beyond the constraints of time and form. These others, as he called them, had shaped the first Wrexhams in the womb, hollowing out the clay of humanity and filling it with an echo of their own essence. The children of the Hollow were born human, but in adolescence came the calling, a cyclical madness that culminated in transformation. The mind was extinguished, the body usurped, and the Hollow ones emerged, vessels for the will of their celestial progenitors. Each generation yields its tithe, Jonah wrote, his script growing unsteady. The Hollow ones are taken, and thus the blood remains untainted by age or weakness. We are their garden, and they, the sowers. But it was a later entry penned in a different hand and dated 1919 that chilled me most. Something has changed. The ones who speak no longer answer. The Hollow ones howl without reason, their hunger grown erratic. They take more now, not once per moon, but whenever the stars align in patterns we cannot fathom. The pact is fraying, and we are losing the pattern. What have we wrought? I dropped the journal, my hands trembling,
my skin slick with a cold that was not of this world. The crawl space seemed to close around me, its walls pulsing faintly in the dark. I fled to my room, the diaries clutched to my chest, and barricaded the door once more. That night the moon was not yet full, yet they came again. I saw them from my window, drifting through the village like specters, their forms more grotesque than before, their limbs twitching as if guided by gods drunk on chaos. One paused beneath the inn, and I knew its face, or what remained of it. It was May, the innkeeper's girl. Her silent mouth had split, a wet, toothless maw stretching from chin to collarbone, and from it poured a sound like rushing water, like the scream of a wind tearing through a dead forest. Her eyeless sockets fixed upon me, and in that moment I felt a pull, not physical but spiritual, as if some part of me yearned to answer her call. My body moved toward the door, unbidden, my hand reaching for the latch. But reason, or perhaps cowardice, prevailed. I stumbled back, collapsing against the wall, and wept as the howls filled the night. I do not recall how I escaped Wrexham Hollow. My memory is a blur of frost and fear, of running through woods that seemed to whisper my name. I awoke in the train depot of Arkham, my clothes soaked with dew, the diaries still clutched in my hands, and the howl echoing in my ears. I am not the same. My dreams come nightly now, of hollow woods where trees bleed starlight, of moons that writhe with faces not their own, of faceless children dancing in rings of bone. My reflection is no longer mine. My eyes are too deep, too empty, and at times I see movement beneath my skin, a subtle ripple as if something stirs within. My thoughts are not always my own. They come in fragments, in whispers, in languages I cannot know, yet understand. And sometimes, just before sleep claims me, I hear the howl again. It is not distant anymore. It is within me. I have burned the diaries, but the words remain, seared into my soul. I have fled Arkham, fled New England, but no distance can sever the thread that binds me to Wrexham Hollow. The stars wheel above, and their patterns are no longer random. They are a map, a summons, a promise. I am not the last. The hollow ones are many, and their hunger is eternal. They are the echo of what made us, and we are but vessels, waiting to be filled. The Idol of Infinite Night. I write these words in the waning hours of humanity's sanity, if sanity yet endures within my ragged mind. The events I chronicle herein have shattered the fragile veil of illusion in which we cower, and have revealed to me the abhorrent truth of our cosmic insignificance. Long nights have passed since the discovery upon which all else grew, and my hands tremble with a fever born of sleepless dread. The walls of my study feel as though they press upon me with unseen eyes, watching as I scribe this confession. My lamp flickered earlier, as if unseen breath had passed close by, and I swear I see shadows waver at the edges of the room. Each letter I inscribe feels like a nail hammered into the coffin of my tenuous reason. It was in the autumn of 1922 that my acquaintance with the unspeakable first began. I was not yet the scholar chronicling forbidden lore that I am today, but merely a humble antiquarian on the outskirts of my career. Then one evening a letter arrived at my Providence home, bearing the seal of the Venerable College of Rhode Island. My colleague, Professor Harold Winthrop, invited me to join an expedition to the desolate reaches of Labrador, where obscure traces of a long-forgotten civilization had been whispered among fearful scholars. He spoke cryptically of strange symbols on ancient charts and fragments of iron from unknown skies. And though his words were framed in the normal pleasantries of invitation, I could sense a tremor in the ink. As I reread his letter by the flickering lamplight, I felt as if the pen itself began to quake on the page. In every eagerly penned word there was an undercurrent of dread, an emotion I could not name, that told me we stood on the brink of something beyond reason. I accepted his summons with an eagerness that was tempered by terror. I spent the weeks before departure in feverish preparation. By day I arranged supplies, compasses, warm furs, lanterns, and a thick copy of the Catalogue of Worlds Beyond Imagining. And by night I pored over star charts and old ethnographies in a near-mad haste. I inked roots in purple haste on parchment, tracing constellations that explorers swore no man should ever follow. Providence shook its head at my wide-eyed obsessions and midnight gatherings of strange tomes, whispering about what scrap of knowledge had driven their quiet antiquarian into the Arctic waste. I answered them only with silence. I felt compelled, as if I sensed in that letter's script the echo of something terrible and inexorable. Our journey northward was fraught with portents. The steamer to St. John's was swallowed by an unnatural fog one evening, and the stars above seemed to leak their pale light like blood from a severed vein. The captain and crew muttered of drowned cities and ghostly leviathans far at sea, their voices thick with superstition. Below decks I lay restless on my narrow bunk, plagued by feverish dreams. I dreamt of cyclopean ruins shimmering beneath the ice, and of monstrous shapes rising from the black ocean. When I awoke, only the steady roll of the vessel remained, yet even then I felt the uneasy sense of an unseen watcher, moving just beyond the hull's tremors. On calm nights at sea, when the vessel rolled gently, I caught glimpses of something far beyond reach, a lantern in the haze, flickering as though to guide me. But when I blinked, it was gone, leaving behind only the spectral dark. The monotony of the voyage only made me more acutely aware of each creak of deck and howl of wind. Each whisper in a tongue I almost understood. By the time we sighted Newfoundland, I had not slept a true night in months. It was a sparse comfort to land at Fortune Bay, but the land did little to soothe our nerves. We chartered a battered schooner across a fjord to St. Anthony, and from there boarded the Iron Horse of the Northern Rail Lines. Even as we advanced on solid ground, each silhouette of spruce and peak seemed to warp at the corners of my vision, as though seen through an unfocused lens. The Labrador tundra unfurled before us in endless waves of white, broken only by the dark ribbons of frozen rivers. Each new day felt elongated. Twilight crept slowly into dawn, as if the sun itself hesitated to cross this nightmare landscape. On crisp nights, the sky held strange lights, a bruised curtain of green and violet that danced and writhed in ways nature never intended. We dared not speak of what we saw, but I could not forget the way those colors seemed like living eyes watching us through the firmament. In those remote hours I often dreamed of monstrous cities under alien skies, and woke each morning with dread clinging to my bones. Even as we settled in that cold cradle of silence, strange signs began to manifest. In the dying light of dusk I saw something moving along a distant mountain slope, a dark silhouette against the pale sky, swift and serpentine. It might have been nothing but wind-blown snow or the shadow of a falling boulder. Yet in that dead hush, it felt dreadfully real, an abominable thing gliding with intent. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The form lingered, then melted away behind a craggy ridge as if it had never been. For a heartbeat I thought I had imagined it, but Dr. Winthrop with night vision eyes muttered under his breath, "Did you see?" And I knew he had seen it too. Our dogs whimpered and backed into the sled, keenly aware of what we could not explain. We exchanged hollow glances. The mountain had shown us a fragment of itself, and we were to remain ignorant of its nature. Professor Winthrop led our small company deeper into the hills at dawn. 2 Inuit guides accompanied us, Hans, a wiry old hunter clutching a carved bone amulet, and Zorion, a silent giant whose eyes were clouded with dread. Neither would speak the mountain's true name, calling it only Carthura's Teeth in hushed tones. With us walked Miss Eloise Tenebrae, a young Egyptologist of formidable resolve. She stepped briskly over ice and snow in her boots, clutching notebooks filled with hieroglyphs and arcane diagrams. We pressed on, each step crunching in the frozen stillness, through a narrow glacier tongue that felt like a long throat leading to unknowable depths. All the while a palpable sense of something ancient watching from above weighed on me, as though we were trespassers upon an altar in the mountains. Even Winthrop seemed driven by fever now. I saw him pause to inspect the odd markings in the ice with an intensity that bordered on madness, though none of us could make sense of their meaning. In our first night at camp, something truly unsettling happened. Hans, the wiry old hunter, simply vanished. We awoke to find the fire cold and the dog sled still, Only Hans's carved bone amulet lay broken on the snow. Dr. Winthrop knelt and pocketed the talisman without a word. Zorion, our other guide, muttered that Hans had always feared the secrets of those ancient mountains. For hours none of us spoke. It felt as if, with Hans' disappearance, the land itself had decided our fate. We were truly alone now with whatever lurked beneath the ice. At last, on the 7th day, we came upon the cavern. Its mouth gaped like a wound in the earth at the glacier's base, as if the mountain exhaled its breath into the sky. The air around us inexplicably warmed and hummed. Colossal pillars of ice and black stone framed the entrance, carved with reliefs that defied reason. Humanoid figures with starfish heads offering prisoners to winged fiends. Serpentine beasts coiling around altars of geometric symbols. The carvings were as fresh as if made yesterday, yet the wind and frost had not touched them. The chill in my spine told me we were about to enter a place older than memory, a chamber built by hands that never cared to live beyond darkness. Our party dared the cavern's depths at last. Zorion murmured a prayer and led with our single lantern held high. Each step echoed hollowly through the vast darkness. The ceiling soared above us into utter black, vanishing from the lantern's reach. Icicles hung like inverted spears, and their occasional drips sounded like distant, dying heartbeats. Eloise kept close behind Winthrop, consulting her notes. She would stop now and then to sketch an unusual symbol in her notepad's edge, as if afraid to let such patterns dissolve without record. The silence grew heavy, the stone walls cold as polished marble, and I felt something, a curious pulse underfoot, as if something vast and inert lay coiled below, sensing our intrusion. At some point I noticed the air had changed, sweet with the decay of something entombed, yet fresh as if meant to purify. My heart rattled in my chest as we descended deeper. At the heart of the chamber, embedded in ice, rested the relic we had come so far to find. If the word relic suffices, it was the bust of some unspeakable entity, carved from a stone so pitch black it seemed to swallow all light. Its surface was mirror smooth and chilling to the touch. The stone head bore no eyes or nose. Instead, a broad, twisted grin was etched into its face. A smile so unnatural that gazing into it felt like staring into nothingness. From its crown sprouted dozens of hooked spines, spiraling outward like the legs of some cosmic arachnid. Tentacular forms emerged from its base, intertwining around arcane sigils that made my skin crawl. To look at it was to feel as though we had unearthed something forbidden. I dared not touch it with anything but my eyes. Even the air around it felt strangely heavy, as if the relic were alive in some unfathomable way. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw its grin twitch, as if amused by our intrusion. We gazed in horrified fascination. Miss Tenebra let out a strangled cry and stumbled backward, her hand flying to her throat. The lantern's light reflected wildly in her eyes as she gaped at the idol. "The cipher! It's alive!" she gasped, her voice trembling. Professor Winthrop lurched forward, fingertips tracing the carved glyphs with feverish intensity. In that instant, a metallic tang like blood and ozone descended on our senses, as if the mountain itself had exhaled centuries of slumbering air. Winthrop gasped and staggered, clutching at his throat. A low subterranean moan undulated through the cavern, a sound more felt in the chest than heard by ears. In that moment, I knew whatever had been sleeping in that stone was now awake. Night had fallen when we returned to camp, and the sky above was a brooding dome of unfamiliar stars. None of us spoke as we set down the heavy crate containing the relic. Miss Tenebra, wrapped in blankets, sat by the fire trembling. Her eyes were vacant and unfocused. She kept murmuring fragments of names. "Yidra, the nameless city," in a voice that was partly her own and partly something else. Dr. Winthrop crouched cross-legged beside the crate, his gaze locked on the black stone within. He cupped the relic in his hands and blessed it softly, muttering, He come, in broken syllables as though the idol might speak back to him. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and our ragged breaths. That night none of us slept. We sat vigil before the relic side by side in the silence, listening for some judgment that never came. Attempting rationality now felt like a cruel joke. I held the relic again in the cold lamplight, heavy, frigid as a demon's heart, and stared at its carvings. The spiral pattern around its neck truly seemed to twist inward to infinity with every look, and the glyphs etched on its surface flowed in impossible geometries, like cosmic laws written in a madman's hand. I blinked, certain they were shifting, as if alive. I ran my fingers along the stone and it vibrated faintly, as if it recognized my touch. Eloise sat nearby, feverishly copying every curve into her notebook, as if compelled, murmuring each symbol under her breath. In that instant I understood. We were facing something beyond the ken of mortal reason, and to comprehend it was to invite madness. My knees gave out and I dropped onto the ice, clinging to my shaking brain to keep some sanity intact. We emerged at dawn's bitter edge. The world outside was subtly changed. The sky was a bruised purple blue, and the pale sun rose slowly, as if loath to see what had been awakened. Even the air felt different, as if carrying a distant cry. We pitched our fire again, though none of us felt warmth. The chill of that stone idol clung to our bones. Professor Winthrop, silent and reverent, locked the relic back in its crate and sealed it with trembling hands. He stood over it, hooded eyes gazing northward, and whispered, "We have done it. We have opened the gate." Eloise sat huddled under blankets, staring at her own hands as if she no longer recognized them. I kept my rifle across my knees, heart pounding. Now that we had brought the darkness into daylight, the relic seemed almost more menacing, as if we had dragged a piece of hell into the open. For hours we sat without speaking, letting the dawn come and go, bound together only by the ruin we shared. That night Miss Tenebra fell ill. She awoke abruptly, convulsing in the dark, eyes rolled back, mumbling unintelligible names. A feverish glow bloomed on her cheeks. Her lips moved constantly, whispering, "Bleeding stars," and "Yidra's dream," as though she understood some message coursing from the void. I rushed to her side and forced warm broth between her lips as she trembled. Her skin was burning hot, and her brows knitted in agony. When she finally spoke aloud, it was in broken phrases, visions of unimaginable constellations and terms I only recognized from arcane legends, as if the relic's secrets were bleeding through her fevered lips. I held her close, noticing how, in the firelight, her eyes flickered with a light not her own. By midnight she drifted into fitful sleep, whispering to the darkness, and I feared what ghosts might hold her hostage. The days that followed descended into a labyrinth of paranoia and dread. Professor Winthrop spent long hours within the shrine he had built for the relic, a crude circle of bones and stones around the crate. He chanted in low, strange syllables. The air around us crackled with static dread, as if the world itself had grown uneasy. In the dim firelight I saw his eyes glaze and reflect like two warped mirrors. He grew gaunt, skeletal, a specter of the man he had been. One midnight I found him inscribing new sigils in the snow with what looked disturbingly like blood, humming about opening the way. He declared with wild eyes that Eloise had seen the pattern of the stars, and that soon all would be revealed. Eloise, delirious and dying, lay nearby, responding in that same alien tongue. It was then I realized part of Winthrop had truly vanished into that idol's madness, and might never return. I shivered as I imagined the price we had paid for curiosity. Even I began to hear them, the whispers. At first, in the dead of night, they were faint, a low susurrus drifting along the ridges, as if the wind had learned to speak. Soon they became constant companions. I lay awake listening as syllables edgewise the air, never quite forming words I understood, but carrying a weight. Some nights I heard them echoing Winthrop's chants, and sometimes they responded as if to questions I did not realize I had asked. I found myself staring into the flickering fire, convinced the dancing flames formed letters spelling out a message just beyond my grasp. Eloise, even in her fever, began to answer them, murmuring back in time to their cadence. It felt in those moments as if we were not alone, as if the cosmos itself had leaned in, listening. And then one dawn, Miss Tenebra was simply gone. We awoke to find her blankets neatly folded and her canteen tipped over on the frozen ground. Outside, her footprints led to the edge of the ice stream, then vanished. The river's surface had refrozen. No path led beyond its brittle thickness. Only her shawl remained, wrapped carefully around the crate. I stared at it in horror, and Winthrop stood over me with a strange, thin smile. "She has gone to join the pattern," he said softly. The word pattern fell between us like a stone, too heavy to lift. None of us moved. Eloise had stepped into whatever nightmare vision she had been shown. The realization shattered something in my heart. We were utterly without her now, and utterly alone. Fear pressed in on me so oppressively that I could not remain. At first gray light, I packed a small rucksack and slung my rifle across my back. "I will descend the glacier and fetch help," I told Winthrop, forcing calm I did not feel. He gave me a distant nod. "You will not find mercy out there," he whispered, his eyes far away. I did not argue. I simply turned and stumbled away, each step a desperate bid for distance from the madness. The trek downward was a blur of shifting snow and narrow ridges. I felt as though the glacier itself were steering me, making paths in the dark for its own inscrutable purpose. On the fourth night, crevices opened and closed under the moonlight, and I nearly fell as ice cracked around me. I dared not look back. I told myself it was the cold and fatigue talking, but each time the wind howled, I swore I heard voices singing in the distance. After 3 days of stumbling travel, I finally reached the outskirts of civilization, a small trading post by the fjord's edge. By that time, I resembled a specter from one of those tales, thin, ragged, eyes hollowed black with death. The moment I entered the tavern, every head turned in horror. The locals wrapped me in blankets and seated me by the hearth, murmuring about some ill stranger. A doctor was fetched at once. He treated my frostbite and found me shaking with fever and shock. When I tried to tell him bits of my tale, an expedition to Labrador, a monstrous idol, my missing friends, only fragments would come. He took notes of my trembling hands and wild eyes and said softly, "You have been through much, Professor." None of them could know the half of it. I lay in a cot that night, gazing at the simple wooden ceiling, and almost longed to believe I had imagined it all. Almost. In the dark of many sleepless nights since then, I have glimpsed things that make my blood run cold. When I close my eyes, I am back in that valley. Beyond the distant mountains, I see an immense city of black marble under alien skies, its spires reaching towards strange suns. I wake with its outlines seared into my mind as though it were real. In waking moments, I sometimes glimpse vast shapes at the edge of my vision, great tentacles curling on the sea, or wings unfurling above a distant mountain, and when I turn, there is nothing but empty air. Once, peering into a shop window, I saw not my own reflection, but 2 dark depths staring back at me, flickering with hidden fury. I sit bolt upright, heart racing, and blame the fire or the wind, but I know now the truth. Those alien eyes still watch me, and perhaps always will. I have come to the twilight of myself. The people of Providence avoid me on the streets, whispering about the ill Professor Mallory, whose eyes are forever black. I suppose they are right. I am no longer the man I was. My hands, once precise with quill and scalpel, now shake with a perpetual tremor. Each day I feel a little more of my reason slip away, sliding into the abyss I glimpsed so briefly. The books and journals that used to be my solace now feel as foreign as the relic we found. Their words twist and fade on the page, unreadable scribbles mocking me. I fear there is no cure for what I have seen, no refuge for the burden I bear. For I have seen the beginning and the end. I have felt at my back the keen scent of eons past and eons yet unborn. From that frozen crucible in the north, something beyond sleep reached out and claimed Winthrop and Eloise as its own. They are lost now, carried off into a vast hunger older than the stars. Even here in my quiet room, I sense its presence, a vast, icy breath just beyond the edge of perception. The universe is no longer cold and empty as we pretend. It watches, and I have become one of its witnesses. Our species is but a fragile ephemera in the great silence, and we dared to poke at depths we never could understand. This is the nightmare I live now. Day and night, the memory of those alien eyes, hollow, infinitely knowing, rests upon my soul. I write this as both confession and warning. though I doubt any lips will ever read it. I have nothing left but this pen and these fevered pages. I welcome the void that has taken my friends, for at least it offers the only mercy I have found. May the cosmos in all its vast indifference finally grant me the oblivion I sought, for I am broken, and the darkness that awakened beneath the glacier has already begun to swallow me as well. If these words survive, let them stand as a testament and warning to the folly of mortal pride. Pray for ignorance, for none can bear so much truth. In the end, I can offer no solace. The stars have told us their secrets, and we are dust before them. If any worthy mind should find this manuscript in the far future, let it serve as a requiem for all those dreams now ruined. There is no justice in this cosmos, only the silent wrath of distant gods. Our lives are pages blown by the wind, and what is left of me now is but scribbles on the last page. I have told all I can, and now I embrace the darkness for what it may bring. May no one else face the truth of what I have seen. And now my tremulous hand will write no more. Let silence be my final companion, and I embrace the night forever. I embrace the night. Thus ends this terrible chronicle. Whatever darkness comes next, I will greet it unafraid. I embrace the night forever.
The Mire of Unfathomable Truths. In the drear autumn of 1927, Arthur Grimsby, a man of no particular distinction save his dogged persistence, found himself summarily discharged from his clerkship at the moldering offices of Hargreave and Sons, a firm of dubious repute nestled in the shadowed alleys of Arkham. The dismissal was abrupt, delivered with the cold indifference of a guillotine's blade by Mr. Hargreave himself, whose rheumy eyes gleamed with an unaccountable malice. "You are no longer required, Grimsby," he intoned, his voice a sepulchral rasp. "Begone!" Thus ejected, Arthur stumbled from the oaken door into the cobbled street, his threadbare coat flapping like the wings of a wounded bird. A sudden shove, whether from a passerby or some unseen force, he could not tell, sent him sprawling into a puddle of viscous mud, its surface iridescent with oily hues that seemed to writhe under the gaslight's flicker. The cold, clinging mire soaked his trousers, and as he struggled to rise, his fingers brushed something hard and unnaturally smooth beneath the sludge. A stone, perhaps, yet its edges were too precise, its surface too warm, as though it pulsed with a life not its own. Arthur's heart, already battered by humiliation, quickened with an instinctive dread. He drew the object forth, wiping away the muck to reveal a disk of black stone, no larger than a pocket watch, inscribed with glyphs that defied all known alphabets. The characters seemed to shift as he stared, curling like tendrils of smoke, whispering in a tongue that was not sound but sensation, a crawling unease that slithered through his mind. He should have cast it away, yet some compulsion, born of despair or darker forces, bade him pocket the artifact and stagger homeward. His lodgings, a squalid room above a fishmonger's shop, offered no solace. The air was thick, and the walls, stained with unwholesome damp, seemed to lean inward as if to smother him. That night, Arthur dreamed of a vast, lightless sea, its depths alive with shapes too colossal and too alien to be comprehended. They moved with a languid malice, their forms obscured by the abyss, yet their eyes, unblinking, fixed upon him with an awareness that stripped his soul bare. From the deep came a voice, not heard but felt, a vibration that spoke his name. "Grimsby, bearer of the sigil, come." He awoke drenched in sweat, the stone disc clutched in his hand, though he had left it on the table. Its warmth had grown, its glyphs now glowing faintly with a sickly green luminescence. In the days that followed, Arthur's life unraveled further. The world seemed to conspire against him. His meager savings vanished, stolen or misplaced. His landlord, a gaunt man with eyes like polished obsidian, demanded impossible rents, and the streets of Arkham grew labyrinthine, their familiar corners twisting into unfamiliar alleys that led to places no map could chart. Compelled by a force he could neither name nor resist, Arthur sought answers in the shadowed stacks of Miskatonic University's library.
a repository of forbidden lore guarded by librarians who watched him with silent suspicion. There, in a tome bound in leather that felt disturbingly akin to human skin, he found reference to the sigil of Ethar, a relic of a pre-human civilization that once worshipped entities beyond the stars. The sigil, it was written, was no mere object but a key, a bridge to realms where the laws of time and space held no sway, and where the great old ones, those dread sovereigns of chaos, slumbered in their deathless vigil. Each night the dreams grew more vivid, more insistent. The lightless sea gave way to a cyclopean city of non-Euclidean geometry, its spires piercing a sky that was no sky but a void of writhing colors. The voice called again, now joined by others, a chorus of inhuman intonations that promised knowledge, power, and truths no mortal mind could bear. Arthur's sanity frayed like a rope, stretching to breaking. He ceased eating, his frame wasting to a skeletal husk. Yet he could not part with the sigil. It was as much a part of him now as his own heart, its pulse synchronized with his own. On the seventh night, driven by a compulsion that drowned out all reason, Arthur descended to Arkham's waterfront, where the Miskatonic River flowed sluggish and black under a moonless sky. The sigil burned in his pocket, its heat searing his flesh, yet he welcomed the pain as a sign of his purpose. At the river's edge, where the reeds whispered secrets to the wind, he raised the disc aloft and spoke the words that had etched themselves into his mind, words no human tongue was meant to form. The air thickened, the stars above dimming as though smothered by an unseen hand. The river churned, its surface parting to reveal a chasm that was not water, but a gateway to the abyss. From it rose a presence, neither form nor substance, but a vastness that crushed the very concept of existence. Its eyes, those same eyes from his dreams, enveloped him, and in their gaze, Arthur saw the truth, that humanity was but a fleeting mote in the infinite machinations of the cosmos, that the great old ones cared not for worship or rebellion, for they were beyond such petty concerns. They simply were, and in their awakening all would be unmade. Arthur Grimsby was never seen again in Arkham. The townsfolk spoke of a man lost to madness, drowned in the river or fled to parts unknown. But in the deep places of the world where the stars cast no light, and time is a forgotten jest, something lingers. A shadow that was once a man, bearing a sigil that burns eternal, a herald of the unutterable truths that await us all when the great old ones stir from their slumber. The Pack of the Black Star. I write these words from a place of trembling dread, hoping that by setting them to paper I might free myself from the nightmares that hound my every waking hour. In the hushed winter of Arkham, beneath leaden skies and skeletal trees, I find myself drawn into an inquiry that defies all rational explanation. A string of bizarre killings has gripped our quiet New England town. Each victim was found savagely torn, as if by the fangs of some feral beast. Yet witnesses speak in terrified whispers of men seen fleeing on all fours into the night. More unsettling still is the common link among both victims and those fleeting, bestial apparitions. All were members of the ill-fated Hanford Arctic expedition. The last of that party vanished from their homes a fortnight past, leaving behind only mystery and blood. I knew one of them in passing, Professor Edwin Hanford, the expedition's leader and namesake. A fellow scholar at Miskatonic University, he was a reserved man of science, not prone to fancy or violence. When news came of the expedition's triumphant return last autumn, with rare meteorite samples from the polar ice, I recall the quiet excitement in the academic circles. No one suspected the horrors that would soon unfurl. It was only when Professor Hanford's wife reported his strange nocturnal wanderings and the wild, furtive look in his eyes that I felt compelled to assist, determined to uncover what malignant force could transform an Arctic explorer into a midnight marauder. In my search for answers, I obtained access to the collected journals, letters, and official logs of the Hanford expedition. These documents, spread before me on my desk, exude a faint odor of decay and a musky animal scent. By lantern light, I delve into those pages, and with each fragmentary entry, a picture of primordial terror begins to take shape. I present here a chronicle of my findings, pieced together from tattered records. May the reader forgive the disjointed nature of this account. It mirrors the shattered minds and fragmented fates of those who penned the lines. The first journal I examined belonged to Dr. Elias Pemberton, the expedition's chief geologist. His early entries describe routine difficulties of Arctic travel in a confident hand. However, the entry dated January 3rd, 1924 stands out for its trembling script and ominous subject. The team had reached a remote glacial basin far north of any prior exploration, guided by anomalous readings on their magnetic instruments. January 3rd, 1924. We have made a discovery beyond our wildest suppositions. Today, at the base of a colossal ice shelf, we uncovered what appears to be a metallic meteorite protruding from the frozen ground. Its exposed surface is black as obsidian and strangely warm to the touch, despite the eternal frost. Surrounding this object, arranged in a rough circle, as if in reverence, were dozens of skeletal remains. These bones, we believe, belong to an ancient species of wolf, perhaps Canis dirus, yet they are aberrant beyond belief. The skulls are unnaturally elongated, with cranial cavities far larger than any known creature of that era. The sight of those bestial skulls grinning through the ice, jaws agape in silent howl, has set the team on edge. An uncanny atmosphere pervades this place. Our magnetic compasses spin uselessly under the meteorite's influence. Dr. Hanford insists we excavate the object at once, hopeful it may yield elements unknown to earthly science. As a geologist, I should be elated, but I cannot dispel a deepening dread. While we labored to free the black stone from its icy tomb, I fancied a faint ringing or whispering emanating from within it. The air was deathly still at that moment, an oppressive silence as though unseen eyes watched us. Our Inuit guide, Nukak, grew pale and agitated. He muttered a final warning about a fallen star and howling spirits, which Dr. Hanford brusquely dismissed. At nightfall, Nukak refused to remain near our camp, pitching his tent far off. His fear has unsettled the others, and I begin to wonder if there is wisdom in the ancient lore we so readily scoff at. Even reading these lines in the safety of my study, I feel the ancient cold and dread creeping from that page. I turn to the next significant entry, written after the meteorite was fully excavated and brought to the expedition's base camp under a canvas shelter. January 7th, 1924. The black meteorite is now free of the ice, nearly 6 feet across, and imperfectly spherical, with unnatural facets as if partially hewn by unknown hands. The wolf skeletons we collected lie with us, but a silent panic grows among us. Last night we found Dr. Peterson, our zoologist, kneeling amid the bones well past midnight, with no memory of how he came to be there. His eyes were wild, and he babbled of a call from the dark between the stars that woke him and drew him out into the blizzard without a coat or lantern. He is resting now, though still agitated. Today we endured a disturbance that has driven our fears deeper. As we hoisted the meteorite onto a sledge, it emitted a sudden vibration, and our instruments went haywire with static. In that instant, an inexplicable darkness fell, though the sky was clear. The sunlight dimmed as if some eclipse or unearthly shadow passed over us. Several of the team cried out, clapping hands to their ears with acute headaches. I felt pressure inside my skull, as if an unseen force were pushing to enter my mind. Then, as suddenly as it came, the vibration ceased and daylight returned. Hanford acts as if it were just a geomagnetic anomaly, but I saw the fear flashing in his eyes. Our guide, Nukak, has fled, taking a sled and dogs under the cover of endless night. Before he left, he warned me with a trembling voice. The Tornuak prowls when the black star awakens. You should not take it from its resting place. I know not what Tornuak means, some demon or spirit perhaps, but his desertion leaves us utterly alone. A pall of isolation hangs over the camp. The Arctic night is endless and strange, the aurora flickering in disquieting colors. I fear we tread at the threshold of revelations, better left entombed in the ice. With tensions mounting, Professor Hanford's official log entry of January 11th, 1924, provides a clinical confirmation of their plight. It recounts that Dr. Peterson suffered a savage fit and had to be restrained after wandering into the snow. and notes the strange howls and wolf-like shapes prowling the camp's perimeter. Hanford concluded they must cut the expedition short and depart at once, despite the deadly winter conditions. The expedition left the ice as soon as conditions allowed, bearing the meteorite in a sealed crate, yet the malady had already taken hold. One shipboard account describes how Dr. Peterson vanished from his locked cabin without a trace during the voyage home, prompting whispers among the crew of uncanny forces at work. By the time they docked in Arkham in late 1924, the survivors were haggard, furtive, and changed in subtle, terrifying ways. Officially, they were celebrated as heroes, but those close to them noticed a strange distance in their eyes and an unpredictability in their tempers, as if some part of them never truly returned from that frozen wasteland. Among the papers I obtained is an unsent letter penned in a shaky script by Dr. Pemberton to his brother, dated October 5th, 1924, mere days after his return to Arkham. It was found folded into the back of his journal, a testament to his disintegrating sanity. Dear Andrew, I pray you forgive the long silence since my return. I scarcely know how to relate what I have endured. My nights are tormented by visions no pen should ever have to record. I dream of a black vault of stars, at whose center looms a single ebony star, blazing with unnatural light. Under its baleful glow, I see shapes moving, wolves the size of horses running on an endless expanse of ice, and among them the shadowy outlines of men, who are not men. They beckon me to join their hunt. In daylight I would dismiss these nightmares as the residue of our ordeal, but other signs defy any innocent explanation. My temperament has grown erratic and savage. Just yesterday I caught myself snarling at poor Margaret over a trivial matter. Worse, I awoke this morning to find clumps of coarse hair on my bedsheets and deep scratches gouged into the floor by my bedside. My fingernails were cracked and bloody, though I recall nothing of the night. I dread to think I myself made those claw marks, crawling about like a beast in darkness. We brought something back with us, Andrew. Of this I am certain. Not merely the meteorite and those accursed bones, but a living malevolence that has seeped into my very soul. It whispers incessantly in the recesses of my mind. At times my thoughts are not wholly my own, as if some ancient intelligence from beyond time, older than the earth itself, were stirring behind my eyes. Blackouts plague me, and I wake with the coppery taste of blood on my tongue and the echo of distant howls in my ears. God help me, I fear what I might have done in those lost hours. I tried to confide in Professor Hanford about my condition, hoping he might admit to similar experiences, but he grew angry and dismissive. There was a light in his eyes that froze me. I suspect he suffers the same affliction, perhaps even more strongly. He spends long hours locked in the university laboratory with the meteorite fragment we brought back, allowing no one else to examine it. Sometimes at night as I pass near the building, I hear a faint humming on the wind, the very same unearthly sound we heard on the ice. I write this to you in case I cannot speak to you again. My humanity slips away with each passing day. I have taken to bolting my bedroom door from the outside each night, hoping to contain whatever I might become until I find a cure, or until this curse runs its course. I dare not seek help from colleagues or doctors. They would call me mad and lock me away. I trust only you, which is why I confide this unspeakable truth. If I succumb to this ancient call, know that I love you, and I am profoundly sorry. Burn this letter. Some knowledge is too terrible to keep. Your brother in despair, Elias. The letter from Dr. Pemberton provides dreadful clarity. The expedition members were changing, their humanity eroding under an alien blight. In the weeks after that unsent plea, the very events he feared came to pass. Professor Hanford's wife awoke one frosty dawn to find him gone, only shreds of his nightclothes left on the doorstep. A week later, Pemberton vanished from his locked study, the door found clawed and splintered from within. In the ensuing weeks, similar fates befell the others. Some were later discovered dead in the woods at the edge of town, bodies savaged as if by wild beasts. Others were never found at all. The authorities were baffled, muttering about wild animals or madness, but I see a pattern their rational minds cannot grasp. A far more terrible truth connects these events. At last I opened Professor Hanford's own journal, recovered from a hidden compartment in his desk. In those final pages, scrawled in an erratic hand, Hanford's measured scientific tone dissolves into madness and exultation. Journal of Professor E. Hanford, undated, late 1924. It is accomplished. The last feeble barriers of flesh and reason crumble before the primordial will. I no longer fight it. I am become one with the voice from beyond. In dreams I have flown on shadowed wings to the gulfs between the stars and seen the truth of the infinite hunger. This intelligence that inhabits us is but a fragment of a greater whole that swarms across the cosmos, consuming world after world. Eons ago, one spark of it rode a dead star and fell to earth when all was young, lying dormant through epochs untold, until our meddling freed it from the ice. Now we, the chosen, are remade as its instruments. My hands twist into claws, and my thoughts are not solely my own, yet I welcome it. The celestial alignment draws near, and soon the voice shall speak in full. Under the auspices of the Black Star, we will hunt as one, rend the flesh of the weak, and howl the gospel of a new age. I write this not to warn, for it is too late for warnings, but to herald the dawn of what comes next. We are the pack of the Black Star, heralds of the immemorial void. Those who are not with us are prey. The night opens to receive its new masters. I go now to join my brethren. Beneath the cold gleam of alien constellations, the ancient hunger rises, and by its will shall the earth be cleansed. The rest is an illegible frenzy of ink, as if the writer fell into a final ecstatic rage. I set down Hanford's journal, my blood running cold as I comprehend the fate that has unfolded. The expedition's influence, this alien contagion of mind and body, is not yet over. It lives on in those transformed souls who slipped away from human sight. They are out there still, a pack of once men prowling the dark outskirts of our world, united under the command of an intelligence that knows no mercy or limit. The string of recent killings, the uncanny howls echoing on lonely nights, even the nameless dread that now gnaws at my mind, all are threads of the same hideous tapestry. As I pen these lines, a restless wind rattles the window panes of my study. The feeble flame of my lantern gutters, as if some unseen draft or presence disturbs it. In the far distance beyond the town, I hear a faint howling carried on the wind. Perhaps it is only the call of wolves from the hills, or perhaps it is something else, beckoning to its kin. I glance to the sky and my breath catches. The clouds have shifted, revealing a single point of light above. It is no true star at all, but a dull, blackish glimmer, an omen hung in the firmament like a watching eye. For an instant under the malevolent sign, dread overwhelms me, and I sense how small we truly are, our vaunted civilization, mere kindling for an oncoming cosmic blaze. The hour grows late, and my lamp is guttering. I know not what the coming days will bring, whether brave souls will track down these abominations, or whether the horror will spread unchecked. I fear humanity stands on the brink of ruin. Should I live to see the morning, I will send these papers to those who may understand and act. Yet a dire intuition tells me my fate may soon follow that of Hanford and Pemberton. The howling beyond the town is growing louder. I am certain now it is not just the wind. There is a scratching at my door, and a low, guttural growl that freezes my veins. My pen falters as terror grips me. They have come. The pack of the Black Star is here, and I can only pray these final words will be found by someone who can heed the warning before the darkness claims us all. The resonance of the unseen. In the sterile, shadowed corridors of Arkham General Hospital, where the air was thick with the acrid tang of antiseptic and an inexplicable undercurrent of ancient decay, Eleanor Varnum stood on the precipice of an unknown abyss. A woman of 32, her gaunt frame and ashen complexion bespoke a soul long besieged by an affliction no physician could name. It was not a malady of the body, but a creeping terror of the mind, a gnawing dread that wove itself into her dreams, conjuring visions of lightless voids and formless entities that whispered in tongues older than man.
The doctors, with their instruments and colder demeanors, had ordered an MRI to plumb the depths of her brain for answers. Yet Eleanor, whose blood carried the weight of ancestors who had pored over forbidden grimoires and gazed too long at starless skies, felt a primal foreboding as she neared the machine. The MRI chamber was a sterile crypt, its centerpiece dominated by a sleek, cylindrical monstrosity that gleamed under the fluorescent lights like the carapace of some dormant leviathan. Its smooth exterior bellied the low, ominous hum that pulsed within, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of her bones. The technician, a lean figure with a sallow face and eyes like twin voids of polished obsidian, instructed her to lie upon the narrow table. "Remain still," he said, his voice a flat, hollow drone that seemed to emanate from some distant, unplaceable source. Eleanor obeyed, though her pulse thundered in her ears, a trapped creature clawing for release. As the table slid into the machine's claustrophobic maw, the sterile walls closed around her, and the darkness swallowed her whole. The machine awoke with a rhythmic clanging, a mechanical heartbeat that reverberated through her flesh and soul. At first there was only the suffocating embrace of the tube and the relentless clamor of the magnets, a staccato pulse that seemed to mock the rhythm of her heart. But as the machine's resonance deepened, a strange vertigo seized her, and the sterile confines of the MRI dissolved like mist before a gale. In its place, Eleanor beheld a vista of cosmic horror, an expanse so vast and alien that her mind recoiled from its immensity. The void before her was no mere absence of light, but a living, pulsating darkness, shot through with veins of sickly luminescence that writhed like tendrils of some vast, unseen organism. The stars, though they could scarcely be called such, hung in the firmament, not as points of light, but as throbbing, malevolent orbs, their surfaces crawling with patterns that suggested both sentience and malice. They pulsed in time with the machine's hum, as though the MRI itself were a key, unlocking a gateway to realms no human eye was meant to witness. The geometry of this place defied all reason, angles bent and folded in ways that mocked the laws of Euclid, forming structures that were at once solid and fluid, eternal and ephemeral. Towers of black, glassy stone spiraled upward into infinity, their surfaces etched with runes that glowed with a light that burned the soul. These edifices seemed to shift as she gazed upon them, collapsing and reforming in patterns that suggested a purpose too vast for her mind to grasp. Between them stretched chasms of impossible depth, from which rose miasmic vapors that coiled into shapes, both beautiful and obscene, suggestions of faces, limbs, and wings that dissolved before they could fully form. The air, if it could be called air, was thick with a cloying metallic tang, and it thrummed with a low, dissonant chant, a cacophony of voices that spoke in syllables no mortal tongue could hope to utter. The sound seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, as though the void itself were giving voice to its ancient, unspeakable will. From the churning depths of this nightmare realm, shapes began to emerge, each more horrific than the last. Vast, gelatinous entities, their surfaces glistening with an oily iridescence, writhed in a grotesque parody of motion. Their forms were never fixed, shifting from bulbous, tumorous masses to attenuated, serpentine coils that seemed to stretch across dimensions. From their quivering bulk sprouted tendrils that ended in clusters of eyes, lidless, unblinking orbs that gleamed with a sickly yellow light. These eyes, countless and unyielding, fixed upon Eleanor with a scrutiny that was both invasive and revelatory, as they saw not only her flesh but the very essence of her being. Some entities bore maws lined with crystalline teeth and shimmered like fractured starlight, while others extruded pseudopods that grasped at the void, leaving trails of phosphorescent slime that burned the air with their touch. As these abominations drew closer, their forms coalesced into a single, titanic presence, a being so vast that its edges blurred into the horizon of the void. Its body was a roiling maelstrom of flesh and shadow, a paradox of substance and absence that seemed to consume the very light around it. Its surface crawled with patterns that suggested both organic decay and mechanical precision, as though it were a machine forged from the corpses of gods. At its center pulsed a single, monstrous eye, larger than a moon,
its iris a swirling vortex of colors no human mind could name. When it gazed upon her, Eleanor felt her thoughts unravel, her memories and fears laid bare before its unrelenting scrutiny. Not with sound, but with a vibration that seared her mind, each word a wound upon her soul. "Thou hast peered through the veil, mortal. The resonance hath awakened thee to the truth that lies beyond." The visions intensified, each more harrowing than the last. Eleanor saw cities of black stone submerged beneath oceans of viscous, tar-like fluid, their spires piercing the surface like the bones of drowned giants. She glimpsed skies ablaze with the light of dying gods, their screams echoing across galaxies as they were consumed by entities vaster still. She witnessed humanity's future, a wretched epoch where men and women, reduced to gibbering thralls, worshipped at altars of living flesh, their minds enslaved to forces older than time itself. The MRI's hum had become a conduit, a bridge between the mundane world and the abyssal realms where the great old ones slumbered. Each pulse of the machine seemed to draw her deeper, her identity fraying as the void sought to claim her. Yet amidst the terror, a spark of defiance flickered within her. Eleanor clung to the rhythm of the machine, using its mechanical cadence as an anchor to her reality. She focused on the cold steel of the table beneath her, the sterile scent of the hospital, the life she had known before this descent into madness. The entities sensed her resistance, and their chant grew louder, more insistent, a symphony of discord that threatened to shatter her mind. The titanic being loomed closer, its eye narrowing as tendrils of shadow reached for her, their touch promising oblivion. But Eleanor, driven by some ancestral wellspring of resolve, forced her thoughts to the mundane, to the world she had left behind. With a wrenching effort, she tore her consciousness free, and the visions collapsed into darkness. When she awoke, she was back in the MRI chamber, the technician's voice crackling over the intercom. "All done, Miss Varnum. You did great." His words were hollow, devoid of warmth. Eleanor's hands trembled as she emerged from the machine, her eyes wide with a knowledge no mortal should bear. The technician's gaze lingered on her, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw a flicker of something inhuman in his obsidian eyes, a glint of the void she had glimpsed. In the days that followed, Eleanor spoke to no one of her ordeal. The physicians found no anomaly in her scans, yet her dread only deepened. The hum of the MRI haunted her, echoing in her dreams and waking moments alike. She began to notice patterns in the world around her, strange geometries in the shadows, whispers in the wind that formed no human words. The hospital, once a place of healing, now seemed a threshold to something older, something watchful. Eleanor Varnum vanished from Arkham soon after. Some say she fled to the sea, seeking answers in the depths her visions had revealed. Others whisper that she returned to the hospital, drawn inexorably to the machine that had opened her eyes to the horrors beyond. The MRI remains in use, its hum a constant presence in the sterile halls. Those who lie within its embrace sometimes speak of fleeting visions, glimpses of impossible landscapes, of eyes that watch from the dark, of a void that hungers. The technicians, ever impassive, dismiss such claims as the fancies of overwrought minds. But in the quiet hours when the hospital sleeps, the machine hums softly to itself, as though chanting to unseen stars, its song a siren call to the abyss. The Thing Within My Blood. I write this account under an awning of mortal terror, my hand trembling and my mind fraying at the edges of madness. In the small hours of the night, within the sterile confines of the very hospital that was once my pride, I commit these final recollections to paper. I do not know how much longer my cognition will remain coherent, for the thing that festers within my flesh advances even as I form each sentence. My condition, this hideous transformation wrought upon my bodily frame, is both my curse and the impetus for this confession. Should any human soul chance upon these pages, know that what I describe is no fevered hallucination, nor mere chimera of a diseased mind, but the true and accursed chronicle of a man's fall into corporeal nightmare and cosmic despair. In my dread, I find myself lapsing into archaic and lofty diction, as if only antique words can bear the weight of this horror. And horror it is, horror of the body and of the spirit, that compels me to set down every loathsome detail. By the flicker of a lone lamp in this lightless ward, I glimpse my own shadow on the wall, no longer fully human. My silhouette is warped by the hideous protrusions that have no place on a natural being, a sight that makes me recoil in nameless loathing. I force myself to record the events that led me here while I still can, before my mind fails or my hand loses its last strength. If I cannot complete this tale, I pray these pages stand as a warning, for within them lie revelations that menace both flesh and soul, blasphemies against the natural order that I pursued in my hubris, never imagining the accursed fate they would bring. Let this testament of a physician who ventured beyond the veil of earthly knowledge and paid an unspeakable price be heard. It is the story of how my body became a battleground for forces beyond human comprehension, and how my quest for a cure turned into a sentence of hideous bodily disillusion and cosmic despair. For 2 decades I served as a physician in this venerable New England hospital, a man of science devoted to alleviating human suffering. I was chief of pathology, not given to superstition, and perhaps overly fascinated by the hospital's own history. Many evenings I spent poring over dusty journals and notebooks of the founders, seeking inspiration. Little did I know that this scholarly curiosity would set me on the path to perdition. It was a mundane yet tragic twist of fate that planted the seed of desperation in my heart. I became my own patient. Some months ago, I received a diagnosis that fell upon me like a death knell. A rare and aggressive cancer nestled deep within my abdomen. Inoperable, the surgeon said, its tendrils winding around arteries where no scalpel could reach. The best treatments of modern medicine, poisons and rays, failed to halt its relentless growth. I watched in mounting terror as the shadow on my scans expanded, a dark bloom of death within me. I knew full well what the prognosis meant, and the clinical certainty of my impending demise haunted my nights. Each day my strength waned, and with it any pretense of scholarly detachment. Fear seeped into my thoughts like a slow poison. I was not ready to relinquish life, nor to abandon my life's work. The idea of such a banal, hideous death felt insulting, as if a blind, idiot force of nature dared snuff out my achievements. In those dark days, reason became a fragile veneer over desperation. I began to contemplate routes of salvation, far outside the sanctioned bounds of medical science. If a cure existed in some dusty corner of forgotten lore, I meant to find it. Many nights I spent in the hospital's library, seeking obscure references to miracle cures and radical treatments. It was during one such midnight vigil, as an autumn storm lashed the window panes with cold rain, that I stumbled upon the clue that would consume me. Tucked away on a high shelf was a slim, leather-bound journal with brittle, yellowed pages filled with spidery script. To my astonishment, I recognized the author, Dr. Phineas Corley, one of the hospital's founding physicians, long dead and half forgotten. My hands trembled with excitement and dread as I realized this journal might hold secrets lost to modern medicine. Eagerly I examined Dr. Corley's journal, oblivious to the malevolent secret it contained. In it, Dr. Corley recounted the aftermath of a meteorite that fell near our town in 1878. A local farmer named Elijah Hooper, who handled a fragment of the fallen star, soon developed a bizarre malady, a gray violet growth consuming his arm. Corley tried everything to treat the man, surgery, chemicals, even cautery, but the abnormal tissue grew back each time, as if endowed with unnatural life. The patient's condition worsened rapidly. The arm became a pulsing mass of alien flesh, spreading tendrils into his body. In delirium, Hooper babbled in no known tongue, and at times an echo like distant thunder underlaid his voice. Desperate, Corley amputated the arm. To his horror, the severed limb writhed on its own, forcing him to burn it to ashes. Hooper died shortly after, but the strange affliction did not spread further, as if whatever contagion he carried had been contained. Corley, deeply shaken, saved a small sample of the anomalous tissue in a jar for further study. In his last notes, he confessed fear that the material was not of this earth and should be sealed away forever. He suspected that in handling the meteor's fragment, they had invited a cosmic plague into their midst. The journal ended abruptly thereafter. Some say Dr. Corley himself went mad and perished soon after those events. I was awestruck by the case, but I did not share Corley's dread. To me, it was not a curse, but a potential miracle. Rifling through the archive, I discovered an old metal canister hidden behind the books. Inside was a glass specimen jar containing the very fragment from 1878, perfectly preserved in amber fluid. The small lump of gray-violet flesh lay suspended, astonishingly intact after all these years. As I held it up, I imagined I saw it quiver in the lamplight, a trick of the eye, perhaps. A chill rippled through me, but it was overcome by a thrill of scientific elation. Here was the life that defied death itself, a secret that might annihilate disease. If I could harness its power, I might yet save myself. Corley's warnings be damned. Equipped with modern knowledge, I would succeed where he could not. In that fevered moment, I chose to ignore the cautious whisper in my mind that some doors should never be opened. Thus began my grand and dreadful experiment. With the morbid prize in my possession, I retreated to the pathology laboratory after ensuring I was quite alone. In the basement of the old wing behind a bolted door, I set the jar upon a metal table under stark white lamps. The walls around me were lined with pickled specimens and dusty anatomical charts, a grotesque audience for what I was about to attempt. My heart pounded with a mix of terror and exaltation as I donned sterile gloves and arranged my instruments. Weeks of illness had left me gaunt and hollow-eyed, but in that moment a fervor akin to madness drove me onward. I carefully opened the jar and fished out the preserved lump of tissue. It was rubbery and gray, with faint violet marbling along its surface. A chemical odor mingled with an underlying sweetness wafted from it. Under the microscope, a thin slice revealed its extraordinary nature. The cells were unlike any I had seen, unnervingly large and complex, each pulsating slowly in unison with the others. When I placed a drop of my own cultured cancer cells beside them, the alien cells extended tiny filaments and relentlessly engulfed the malignant cells. It was as if the sample was actively attacking the disease. Time was critical. Every passing day the tumor inside me grew. Any conventional study would take far too long. I resolved to take the risk. Using a sterilized blade, I diced part of the sample and ground it into a slurry with saline. The solution in the syringe gleamed faintly opalescent under the lamp. Lying on a gurney, I palpated the cruel lump in my abdomen, my death made tangible, and slid the long needle directly into its heart. I injected the strange elixir into my own flesh. The effect was immediate and excruciating. A searing heat spread through my gut, drawing a strangled cry from my throat. A fog of agony and exhaustion enveloped me. I must have lost consciousness for a time, for I awoke on that gurney, drenched in cold sweat and disoriented. Gingerly, I pressed trembling fingers to my abdomen. To my astonishment, the tumor's outline had softened and begun to shrink. The alien cells were devouring it from within, just as I had hoped. For the first time in months, I felt the weight of death begin to lift, if only by a slender thread. That night I remained in the lab, monitoring myself. Apart from a slight fever and local soreness, I felt better than I had in weeks. I drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep right there on the gurney. When I awoke, aching but energized, I confirmed that the tumor had further diminished. My recovery seemed nothing short of miraculous. I left the lab by dawn's light with secret triumph thrumming in my veins. Yet amid my elation lurked small portents of peril, signs I willfully ignored. The skin around the injection site had taken on a grayish pallor that did not fade. A faint tingling skittered across my abdomen now and then. My appetite, once ravaged by illness, returned with a peculiar ferocity. I craved meat, bleeding, rare, and devoured it with an appetite that would have embarrassed me in saner times. I dismissed these anomalies as trivial side effects of healing. In blissful ignorance, I went about my duties the next day, convinced all was well. I could not know that this was merely the calm before the storm. My first disquieting dream came the following night. I slept in my own bed at home for the first time in ages, expecting peaceful rest. Instead, my slumber was a doorway to madness. I found myself standing in an alien landscape, under a black vault of sky pricked by unfamiliar constellations. The ground was not solid earth, but pulsing, wet, organic matter, as if I walked upon the flesh of some colossal being. Each step sank slightly into the yielding terrain, which throbbed with a slow, rhythmic pulse. In the distance, cyclopean shapes like monstrous fungi or polyps towered and swayed, though the air was deathly still. I tried to scream, but no sound came. Looking down, I saw my skin had turned slate gray, like the ground, and my arms were grotesquely elongated. Fingers melted into quivering tentacles. Instead of my scream, from all around me echoed a distant, low thunder. A reverberation felt more in my bones than heard with my ears. It was as though some colossal heart were beating in the dark, in sync with the pulse beneath my feet. I jolted awake, gasping and drenched in sweat. It was morning. Pale light filtered through my curtains. Heart pounding, I pressed a hand to my side. The area around the injection site throbbed dully. When I lifted my nightshirt, a chill coursed through me. The gray patch on my skin had spread wider overnight, snaking toward my ribs. Though it hurt to admit, the resemblance to poor Hooper's condition in Corley's tale was unmistakable. For a long moment I sat on the edge of my bed, struggling to gather my resolve and not give in to panic. Determined to investigate further, I returned to the hospital and secluded myself in the lab at dawn. With shaking hands, I drew my blood and peered at it under the microscope. What I saw turned my stomach. My blood was already tainted with that otherworldly cellular form, a chimera of human and alien. Under the lens, I watched the intruding cells ensnare and devour my own blood cells. There was no denying it now. The invader was spreading through me. A desperate plan formed in my mind. Corley had ultimately halted Hooper's corruption by amputating the infected limb and burning it. My affliction was more internal, but perhaps I could still excise the principal site of invasion. If I cut away all the tissue around the injection area, maybe I could remove the foothold of the thing inside me before it took over completely. It was a ghastly gamble, but the alternative, being consumed, was unthinkable. I fortified myself with morphine and local anesthetic, laid out a mirror and surgical tools, and prepared to perform an operation that any sane doctor would deem impossible, excising a part of my own flesh. In the mirror's reflection, I looked like a man already half in the grave, pale, eyes wild, sweat beading on my brow. Still, my resolve was firm. I sterilized a scalpel and swabbed iodine around the grayish patch that marred my side. I steeled myself and made an incision around the discolored flesh on my side. Blood welled as I cut deeper, revealing gray, violet tendrils running through my muscle. Fighting the urge to faint, I carved out gobbets of tainted meat and dropped them onto a tray. The removed pieces twitched, connected by sinewy filaments to what still remained inside me. Suddenly, pain beyond bearing shot through my core. A tendril of the thing uncoiled from the open wound, as if to defend itself. I choked back a scream and pressed an alcohol-soaked swab to the writhing filament, and then touched it with the flame of a lighter. The slender tentacle recoiled and then shriveled to ash, filling the air with the stench of charred corruption. Gasping, I saw no further movement within my wound. Trembling, I swept the extracted tissue into the incinerator, watching the quivering chunks burn to cinders. My desperate surgery had removed as much of the infestation as my strength allowed. Weak from agony and blood loss, I could only bind the gaping wound and collapse against the wall, praying I had cut out the evil in time. I awoke some time later, hours or mere minutes, I could not tell, lying in a sticky puddle of my own blood and antiseptic on the lab floor. Dazed, I lifted myself and became aware of a dreadful itching and pulling sensation along my side. With a grimace, I peeled away the now sodden bandage. What I beheld nearly plunged me into despair. The gash I had carved was no longer an open wound. Overnight it had been partly woven shut by fibrous gray tissue. New tendrils of alien flesh crisscrossed the incision, knitting my own meat together in a grotesque makeshift repair. It was as though the intruder provoked by my assault had labored to heal and fortify its foothold within me. A sob of anguish escaped my lips. My attempt to save myself had only demonstrated the thing's tenacity. When I staggered to my feet, a wave of dizziness and nausea nearly sent me tumbling again. A deep ache suffused my muscles and bones. Pressing a hand to my chest, I felt a bizarre double rhythm there. My heart galloped from panic, but beneath that, slower and steadier, a second throb pulsed. I realized with dawning horror that an alien heartbeat echoed within me, out of sync with my own. A second heart, or something like it, was beating in tandem with my life. The thought was so unbearably obscene that I retched dryly. In the mirror above the sink, a stranger's face glared back at me. My skin hung pale and loose, and along my jaw I could see ridges beneath the surface, cords of unnatural tissue winding under my flesh. A tuft of my hair fell away as I ran a shaking hand through it, the strands coming out brittle and lifeless. These small deformities coalesced into a single dreadful reality. I was well on my way to becoming something monstrous. In that moment, I confess, I longed for death. Better to die as a man than live as an abomination. I even fumbled for a scalpel with the intent to open my own throat. But as the blade hovered at my neck, a sudden convulsion of pain racked my skull. I heard a low whispering in my head, not in my ears, but within my mind, and I felt an alien will coil around my own like constricting veins. Whether it was the creature's survival instinct or a hallucination born of trauma, it stayed my hand. My muscles jerked involuntarily, sending the scalpel clattering to the floor. I realized with dismay that the thing would not even allow me the mercy of a quick end. I was a prisoner in my own body, and the jailer was the horror I had invited inside. Time lost all meaning as I sank into a corner of the lab, my consciousness flickering between exhaustion and delirium. It was then that the visions began to encroach upon my waking senses, just as they had in my dreams. In the periphery of my vision, the shadows of the room quivered and took on unnatural shapes reminiscent of that otherworldly landscape. I blinked, and for an instant the tiled floor was slick and spongy like living flesh. I blinked again, and it was solid stone. Reality itself seemed to waver. My ears caught a distant reverberation, the same phantom heartbeat from my dreams, pounding from deep within my own chest as much as from the air. The boundary between me and it, between reality and nightmare, had grown terrifyingly thin. As the invader's tendrils spread through my nervous system, I felt my consciousness being drawn into a vast and alien presence. My mind was dragged toward union with a far larger awareness that spanned eons. I realized the entity was sentient and ancient, traveling on the meteor like a spore on the galactic winds. As it spread through my nerves, I caught flashes of its memory, swirling stars, the frigid dark of interstellar space, and a ravenous hunger waiting millennia for sustenance. I sensed its triumph at finding our fertile world. This was no unique event. Earth was but one more host in an endless cosmic cycle. In my mind, a kind of silent scream resounded, a last cry of protest from the soul of a man I once was. It was the cry of a mind confronted with its utter insignificance against the scope of this cosmic incursion. What was one feeble human will against an ancient entity that had traversed gulfs of space? I understood with soul-crushing clarity the despair at the heart of all cosmic horror, that we are small, transient, and fundamentally powerless before the uncaring forces that stalk the universe. And yet, as I write this, some shred of me remains, enough to wrest temporary control and set these final words down. The very act of writing has given me a last anchor of identity against the tide that seeks to overwhelm me. But I feel that anchor slipping. The thing inside grows stronger each moment. I feel it thrumming in my brain, tugging at my thoughts. My fingers even now twitch and spasm unnaturally, as if puppeteered. The flesh of my hand creeps with gray discoloration, and my joints crack as they distort. It takes all my waning will to form each letter. To whoever finds this document, I implore you, do what I no longer can. I have barricaded myself in this lab, but soon the creature that moves my limbs will seek escape to spread its contagion further. You must not let that happen. When you enter, if I have not already destroyed myself in some final act of humanity, you must be prepared to confront something that only wears the tattered semblance of a man. Do not hesitate if it speaks with my voice, or wears my face. It is an abomination. You must destroy it utterly by fire. Burn this body to ash, and ensure no fragment remains, lest the horror rise again. I can feel my thoughts dissolving now, drowned by a tide of alien exaltation. My flesh is no longer flesh, but a conduit for something foul and magnificent. There is a joy welling up inside that is not mine, a heinous joy at the dawning of a new hybrid birth. Yet the sliver of me that remains is filled with absolute terror and loathing. I hear wet, heavy sounds, my bones bending, my tissues sloughing off to make way for the creature's final emergence. The stench of spoiled meat and decay chokes the air. My vision fades, the pen slips from my failing grasp, and I scrabble to seize it again. These may be the last words I write as myself. The final convergence is at hand. The heartbeat is one. If you read this, if you hear a voice pleading from my lips, remember, it is the monster pleading, not me. Destroy us. Destroy me.
Whispers beneath Dunridge. In the autumn of 1923, the town of Dunridge, Massachusetts lay smothered beneath a pall of unease. Tucked within a valley where the Dunridge River coiled like a serpent, the town was a cluster of sagging rooftops and weathered clapboard, its streets shadowed by pines that seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. At the heart of this malaise stood the Murmuring Stone, a black basalt monolith in a clearing 2 miles from town, where no birds sang and the earth felt hollow underfoot. For generations it had been a fixture of local lore, tales of wayward souls lost to its whispers, of dreams that twisted into madness. But now, the voices were louder, a sibilant tide that seeped into the minds of Dunridge's folk. 6 souls had vanished in 3 months, their names spoken in hushed dread: farmers, travelers, and most recently, Arthur Mallory, a young veteran whose obsession with the stone had led him to its shadowed embrace. The air grew thick with a nameless fear, as if the earth itself held its breath. Beneath the soil, something stirred, not dead, but waiting. Dr. Lydia Trask, a Miskatonic University archaeologist, arrived in Dunridge on a chill October evening, her skepticism a shield against the town's superstitions. 32, with sharp gray eyes and a mind honed by years of excavating forgotten ruins, she dismissed the stone as a curiosity, likely a glacial erratic adorned with native carvings. Yet her rationality was a fragile veneer. For weeks her sleep had been plagued by dreams of a lightless chasm where voices chanted in a tongue that had made her skin crawl. She attributed them to overwork, but they clung to her like damp rot. At Dunridge's only inn, a creaking relic called the Hollow Oak, she met Sheriff Amos Harrow, a man in his late 40s. Harrow's face was etched with the weight of years, his eyes shadowed by secrets he kept locked behind a gruff demeanor. "Folks say the stone's cursed," he said, over a glass of watery ale, his voice low. "Best to leave it be, Doctor." His warning only stoked Lydia's resolve. She had come to uncover the truth behind the disappearances, and no rural superstition would deter her. Harrow reluctantly shared what he knew. Arthur Mallory, a gaunt World War I veteran with a penchant for the occult, had been the latest to vanish. 2 weeks prior, deputies had found his camp near the stone, tent torn, sketches of alien glyphs scattered, and a journal stained with what Harrow hoped was mud, but feared was blood. Lydia secured the journal, its pages a descent into obsession. Arthur wrote of the stone, speaking to him, promising knowledge of a sleeper beneath the earth. "It knows my name," he scrawled, the ink smudged as if written in haste. The gate must open. Lydia's scientific mind recoiled, yet the glyphs sketched in the journal echoed those in her dreams, their angles defying Euclidean logic. She resolved to visit the stone, and Harrow, with a grimace, agreed to escort her. The trek through the woods was a descent into oppression. The pines loomed, their branches knitting a canopy that choked the sunlight. The air grew heavy, tasting of iron and decay. The clearing, when they reached it, was a wound in the forest, a circle of barren earth where the stone squatted, 5 feet tall and unnaturally smooth, its surface carved with sigils that seemed to writhe under scrutiny. Lydia's pulse quickened as she approached, her instruments forgotten. The stone was warm to the touch, pulsing faintly, and as her fingers grazed its edge, a voice, not heard but felt, slithered through her mind. "You are known." She staggered back, breath ragged, and caught Harrow's gaze. His expression was unreadable, but his hand rested on his revolver. "Told you," he muttered. Lydia said nothing, her rationality fraying. In Dunridge, the stone's awakening fueled a fever of fear and fervor. Reverend Elijah Crane, a wiry man with eyes like burning coals, preached of a coming apocalypse from the pulpit of St. Dymphna's, a crumbling church on the town square. "The sleeper stirs," he bellowed, his sermons laced with visions of a world drowned in shadow. His congregation, pale, fervent faces, nodded in unison, their murmurs echoing the stone's whispers. Lydia attended a service, her notebook filling with observations. Crane's words struck too close to her dreams, describing a gate and a formless hunger that waited beyond. After the service, she approached him, but Crane's smile was a blade. "You seek truth, Doctor," he said, "but some truths devour." His cryptic warning lingered as she left, her unease deepening. Seeking answers, Lydia visited Helen Voss, an elderly recluse who lived in a decaying cottage at the town's edge. Helen was a specter of a woman, her white hair wild, her eyes sunken with grief. Her home was a shrine to the stone, walls plastered with yellowed sketchings of its glyphs, drawn by her late husband, Jacob, who had died a decade prior near the clearing. "He heard it," Helen rasped, clutching a sketch like a talisman. "The stone called him, and he answered. He's still there, listening." Lydia pressed for clarity, but Helen's voice dropped to a whisper. "The Silent Order guards it. They've always guarded it." When Lydia asked about the Order, Helen's eyes darted to the window as if expecting watchers. "They're everywhere," she hissed. "In the church, the fields, even the sheriff's blood." Lydia's research in Dunridge's meager library, a damp room above the town hall, unearthed fragments of their existence. Founded with the town in 1692, the Order was a cult cloaked in respectability, its members posing as farmers, merchants, even deacons. They revered the stone as a sentinel guarding a sleeper beneath the earth. Rituals hinted at blood offerings and chants to keep the sleeper dormant. Harrow's family name appeared in faded ledgers, tied to the Order's inner circle. Confronting him, Lydia found his defenses crumbling. "My grandfather was one of them," he admitted, his voice raw. "He said the stone's a lock, holding something back. The Order's kept it shut for centuries, but it's slipping. Mallory, he meddled, tried to open the gate. Now it's waking." Harrow revealed that Arthur had been seen chanting at the stone, carving glyphs into the earth before he vanished, leaving only a blood-streaked patch of soil. Lydia's dreams grew unbearable. Each night she stood before a chasm where the stone hovered, its whispers coalescing into a voice that shook her bones. "Free me." Shapes moved in the dark, formless yet alive with malign intent. She awoke gasping, her hands clawing the air. The journal's glyphs burned into her mind. Desperate, she organized a final expedition to the stone, enlisting Harrow and a reluctant Crane, whose prayers now sounded like pleas for mercy. They reached the clearing at dusk, the sky a bruise of purple and gold. The stone pulsed, its sigils glowing faintly, and the earth was scarred with fresh carvings, glyphs from Arthur's journal, arranged in a spiral. The air thrummed with a low, resonant hum, and the ground trembled as if something vast shifted below. Crane clutched his Bible, muttering verses that twisted into older, stranger words. Harrow's revolver gleamed in the fading light, his face pale.
Lydia knelt to examine the glyphs, her fingers tracing their unnatural angles. The hum grew louder, a vibration that rattled her teeth, and the stone's whispers became a chorus. Now. Helen Voss appeared then, unbidden, her frail form swaying as she emerged from the trees. Her lips moved in a chant, guttural and ancient, her eyes fixed on the stone. He's coming, she keened, and Lydia realized she meant not Jacob, but something older, vaster. The earth split with a groan, a fissure yawning wide, exhaling a stench of sulfur, decay, and an alien rot that defied naming. From its depths rose tendrils of shadow, not light's absence, but a presence that devoured it, coiling toward the surface like the limbs of some unfathomable beast. Lydia's mind reeled as the whispers became a command. Serve. Crane fell to his knees weeping, his Bible forgotten. Harrow fired into the fissure, the shot swallowed by the dark. Helen laughed, a sound of mad triumph, her chant rising to a scream. The tendrils reached for her, and she stepped forward as if embracing a lover. Lydia alone resisted, her rationality a fading ember. She seized Arthur's journal, its pages now warm, almost alive. A final entry scrawled in a trembling hand read, "To close the gate, blood must answer blood." With no time to question, Lydia drew her knife and slashed her palm, letting her blood drip onto the stone. The whispers screamed, a sound that clawed at her sanity, tearing at the edges of her mind. The fissure shuddered, the tendrils retreating, and the earth began to close, sealing the horror below. Helen collapsed, lifeless, her body crumpling like ash. Crane fled into the woods, his sobs fading into the night. Harrow, bloodied from a tendril's graze, helped Lydia stagger back to town, the stone's silence a fragile reprieve. Dunridge seemed unchanged, yet Lydia saw the order's faces in the crowd, farmers, shopkeepers, even the innkeeper, watching her with veiled eyes. She left the next day, her report to Miskatonic a sterile account of geological anomalies and mass hysteria, but the truth gnawed at her. Arthur's fate remained unknown, though in her dreams his voice joined the stone's chorus, pleading or commanding. The silent order endured, tended to their secret rites, ensuring the stone's whispers stayed faint for now. Lydia burned Arthur's journal, but the glyphs lingered in her mind, as did the certainty that the sleeper waited, patient as eternity. In Dunridge the stone stood silent, its surface cold once more, but beneath the soil in a lightless gulf, where time held no sway, something stirred, dreaming of the day its gate would open. For that which is not dead can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die.
Echoes of darkness. The rain was relentless, hammering down on the narrow alley in sheets, transforming the cobblestones into a slick, treacherous path that echoed each footfall like the whisper of a ghostly chase. John Harlow pulled his coat tighter against the wet chill, his eyes glowing with an inner light, fixed intently on the modest brick building ahead. The building loomed at the alley's end, silent and foreboding, as if anticipating his arrival. The door was ajar. Harlow paused before the threshold, the investigator's instinct whispering caution into his ear. The dim interior offered little comfort. A single, sputtering gas lamp threw weak light onto the walls scarred with burned symbols. The floor, a chaotic sea of shredded books and splintered wood, told a story of violent disruption. "Dr. Eldritch?" he murmured into the oppressive silence, his voice a ripple in the stagnant air. Harlow stepped carefully, his shoes disturbing the debris-strewn floor as he moved toward the heart of the room. His coat dripped steadily onto the stained floorboards, marking his passage in water and intent. The alley behind him narrowed into obscurity, the rain's insistent tattoo swallowing any distant sound. Harlow hesitated again, the investigator's instinct, a lifelong companion, advising patience and caution. The building waited in silence, its heavy door half open like a mouth caught mid-sentence. He lingered there, a shadow framed by a darker void, before allowing the mystery to draw him inside. Each step he took was deliberate, measuring the echo of his own movement against the peculiar hush that filled the space. It was a silence that spoke of expectation, a room holding its breath. The gas lamp's thin light flickered as if reluctant to illuminate the truth. Harlow's sharp eyes missed nothing. Symbols burned into peeling wallpaper, their edges curling away as if scorched by some arcane heat. A clutter of shredded papers lying like fallen leaves around a splintered desk. The room was a battlefield, an academic's last stand against incomprehensible forces. The air was thick with disquiet, an oppressive weight that pressed in on him from all sides. He stood amidst the chaos, his senses heightened, absorbing every detail. It was not the first time he had entered such a scene, nor, he suspected, the last. "Dr. Eldritch," he called again, his voice measured, yet insistent. He moved further into the room, carefully avoiding the charred debris that littered the floor. His coat dripped onto the wood, the sound a metronome counting the seconds of uncertainty. Harlow's mind raced ahead of him, connecting fragments of evidence with threads of intuition. He knew Eldritch well enough to suspect this was more than a mere accident. There was purpose behind the destruction, a hidden narrative waiting to be uncovered. He circled the room like a predator, stalking elusive prey, his presence stirring the stale air. Each object told part of the story, yet none revealed the whole. The oppressive atmosphere mixed with his own apprehension, creating a tension that wound tighter with every step. Harlow paused at the center of the room, turning slowly to take it all in. His breath came steady, but his heart betrayed a quicker pace. It was a scene that spoke directly to him, in a language he had become all too familiar with. Despite the turmoil, there was a method to his movements, a calculated path through the chaos. His mind, sharp and relentless, catalogued each piece of evidence, the symbols, the papers, the violence of the disruption. They were all pieces of a puzzle, and he was determined to solve it. Yet beneath his professional resolve lay a deeper unease, an echo of personal experience that whispered caution to his racing thoughts. The mystery was not just academic, it was deeply, hauntingly, personal. He stopped again, this time near the shattered remains of a desk. His eyes lingered on the burned and shredded documents, recognizing the traces of Eldritch's precise hand in the margins. The sight triggered a mix of emotions, concern for his colleague, a surge of investigative thrill, and an undercurrent of dread. Harlow's world was one where the unexplained often became the unbearable. He knew all too well the risks of delving too deeply, yet he also knew he could not turn away. He was bound to the truth, regardless of the cost. The silence of the room bore down on him, heavy and accusatory, as if questioning his very presence. He felt the weight of it like a judge passing sentence, but he was not a man to be easily swayed. Each detail he absorbed only strengthened his resolve. He was here for answers, and he would not leave without them. Dr. Eldritch's fate hung in the balance, and so did Harlow's own understanding of the forces at play. He called Eldritch's name once more, this time with a note of urgency that cut through the air like a knife. The room remained mute, holding its secrets close. Harlow's breath misted in the chill as he surveyed the devastation one last time. He had seen similar scenes, but never without consequence. The faint sound of dripping water, the irregular flicker of the lamp, and the sight of his own hand trembling slightly as he reached for a singed document, all converged into a moment of clarity. The horror was not in what he saw, but in what he knew he might discover. Harlow stood at the center of it all, an island of determination in a sea of doubt. He knew the stakes, he knew the risks, yet his commitment to the truth was unwavering. The scene before him was a challenge, a test of both intellect and will. He had already paid a high price in his life for asking the wrong questions, but that had never stopped him before. He steeled himself against the room's suffocating atmosphere and prepared to dive deeper into the mystery that lay ahead. Harlow moved with the precision of a surgeon, sorting through the chaos with practiced intent. The dim light of the gas lamp threw his shadow against the wall, a dark twin mirroring his every motion. He stood as an island of calm amidst the debris, his focus unwavering despite the destruction around him. The yellowed notes spoke of Eldritch's research, and as he sifted through them, his eyes caught on a page that connected Vale Mythos to an entity named the Echo. The discovery sent a shiver down his spine, excitement mingled with a sense of creeping dread. He lingered over a drawing that seemed to depict fractured versions of his own likeness, and his hand trembled as he put it aside. A broken mirror drew his attention, its shards reflecting ghostly silhouettes that multiplied and twisted with unsettling precision. "This cannot be real," he whispered, his voice mingling with the ominous silence. A distant creak broke the quiet, a door closing somewhere in the depths of the building, leaving him alone with the evidence and his growing unease. The oppressive atmosphere closed in around him, and the chill of the room seemed to seep into his bones. Yet Harlow continued his search, undeterred by the haunted quiet that surrounded him. His breath was steady, a rhythmic counterpoint to the irregular flicker of the lamp that cast an uncertain light on the papers before him. He shuffled through them methodically, piecing together fragments of Eldritch's research. Each page held the promise of revelation, but the more he uncovered, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. The journal lay open on the desk, its pages covered with hurried annotations and cryptic diagrams. The words Veil Kythos and the Echo leapt out at him, a thread of meaning in a tangled web of the unknown. Harlow's pulse quickened with the familiar thrill of discovery, tempered by the gnawing fear of what such knowledge might cost. He bent over the journal, scrutinizing each mark, as if sheer will could force the text to yield its secrets. Harlow's hand paused over a notebook bound in cracked leather. The paper was old, the ink faded, yet the contents struck him with the force of a physical blow. He stared at a drawing that showed multiple, disjointed figures resembling his own form. A tremor passed through him, and he laid the notebook down with more care than intention. The image lingered in his mind, a specter that refused to fade. The cracked mirror at the edge of the room drew his eye, its surface a chaotic array of angles and reflections. Harlow turned toward it, watching as ghostly silhouettes seemed to multiply and shift, each echoing his stance with unsettling precision. It was as if the mirror captured not just his likeness, but something deeper, a distortion of his very being. The sight was both mesmerizing and terrifying, a visual embodiment of the fractured reality he'd long feared. "This cannot be real," he murmured, his voice barely more than a breath in the stillness. The words were both a plea and a denial, a fragile hope that reality was not as mutable as it appeared. Yet he knew better. The room, the notes, the reflections, they were pieces of a puzzle, a cosmic joke at his expense. Harlow had been down this path before, and it never led to anything good. A sudden creak broke the suffocating silence, the sound of a door closing somewhere distant. It reverberated through the building like a heartbeat, suggesting a presence he had not yet accounted for. Harlow froze, listening intently, every sense on high alert. The creak faded, but its implications lingered, an unspoken threat hanging in the air. He remained still, the cold seeping deeper into him, each second stretching out like an eternity. The room around him was a tableau of unease, every element contributing to a sense of wrongness that was almost overwhelming. Yet Harlow was a man accustomed to the unbearable. He drew a deep breath, steeling himself against both the physical chill and the existential dread that threatened to engulf him. Despite the disarray, Harlow's mind raced with the thrill of a mystery on the brink of solution. The connections between Eldritch's work and his own recent encounters were too strong to ignore. Yet with each discovery came a deeper question, an infinite regress that spiraled into uncertainty. The evidence was both a guide and a warning, urging him onward, even as it cautioned against delving too deeply. The echoing door had left a residue of tension, a reminder that he was not alone in his pursuit of the truth. Harlow felt the weight of it, an invisible presence that seemed to hover at the edge of perception, but he was not one to be easily dissuaded. His resolve hardened with each passing moment, crystallizing into a singular focus. He would find out what had happened to Dr. Eldritch, and what role this unknown entity, the Echo, played in the chaos. He stood among the ruins of the study, his silhouette reflected and refracted in the broken mirror. The reflection seemed to watch him, a silent audience to his private drama. Harlow knew he was on dangerous ground, but it was ground he had traversed before. The path was fraught with peril, but the alternative, turning away, leaving questions unanswered, was not one he could accept. He took a step back from the mirror, breaking the visual spell that held him transfixed. The action was simple yet significant, a gesture of defiance against the forces that sought to unbalance him. Harlow's world was one where the boundaries of reality were often porous, but he refused to let that deter him. His commitment to uncovering the truth, regardless of its nature, was as relentless as the rain that continued to batter the world outside. Alone with the evidence and his growing unease, Harlow allowed himself a brief moment of introspection. He was aware of the risks, the personal costs of pursuing such knowledge, but he was driven, perhaps even fated,
to seek out the things others turned away from. The unresolved mysteries of Eldritch's work and the unsettling presence of the echo were challenges he could not ignore. The scene before him was a tapestry of potential and peril, each thread woven with both meaning and malice. Harlow felt the weight of it, the almost crushing responsibility of interpreting what others deemed uninterpretable. Yet he knew he would persist. The unknown was his territory, his element. He would find Eldritch, or at least discover what had become of him, and in doing so, perhaps confront the very thing he most feared, the echo of his own obsessions. The door moaned like a wounded thing as John Harlow entered the cramped study, its hinges dragging shut with a reluctant finality. Charred papers lay scattered across the floor, like fragile, wounded birds, and he navigated them with careful urgency, his footsteps echoing with purpose. A desk, marred by deep, burnt symbols, stood at the center, its surface a battlefield of scorched wood and shredded notebooks. His intense eyes, glowing with otherworldly light, scanned the chaos with methodical precision. He paused at a torn page, the names Vale Kythos and the Echo slashing through the wreckage like curses. He whispered to the desolate air, "Dr. Eldritch, what did you uncover?" The room was a symphony of ruin, a monument to some desperate struggle now past. Each shred of paper and scarred surface told its own story of violence and revelation. John moved between them like a grim archivist, cataloging the devastation with cold, professional detachment. Yet beneath his calm exterior, an undercurrent of urgency drove him. His fingers brushed against a half-burned notebook, and he picked it up with careful hands, peeling open its crumbling cover. The words within were jagged and fevered, each one etched in the ink of obsession. His presence seemed almost spectral, a figure both part of and apart from the material world. The eldritch glow in his eyes cast long, distorted shadows that writhed like living things across the room's blistered walls. He gathered more pages, his movements a study in meticulous despair. Here were cryptic formulas, there the twisted hieroglyphics of some ancient alien script, all of it connected, all of it severed from understanding. John's breath caught in his throat as he reached for a stack of loose notes, their edges blackened by the touch of some consuming flame. He fanned them out before him, arranging their tattered pieces like a jigsaw puzzle from hell. Words leapt out at him, both familiar and profane. Temporal disturbance, unbound reflection, the echo, Vale Kythos. His shoulders tightened, and he closed his eyes, feeling the weight of each syllable sink into him like lead. He set the papers down and took a step back, running a hand through his dark, silver-threaded hair. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, suspended in the awful stillness that follows a cataclysm. His eyes, those piercing instruments of perception, settled on the desk again. The deep symbols scorched into its surface were no mere decoration. They were wards, barriers against something that had been neither held nor hindered by their presence. He traced one with a fingertip, feeling the rough char beneath his skin, and shivered. A heavy sigh escaped him, and he moved to the room's scorched wall. The marks there told their own story of Dr. Eldritch's final stand, and of whatever thing had come to visit him. The old scholar had known what he was doing. John respected him for that, and envied him too. To go so far and fall so terribly short, it was the risk they all took, those who reached into the abyss for answers. He whispered again, a question to no one, a challenge to the silence. "Eldritch, what did you see?" He flipped through the notes again, laying them in a rough sequence across the desk. His analytical mind pieced together the fractured narrative, weaving its disparate threads into a tapestry of foreboding. With each new page, the story grew clearer, and his own part in it more inevitable. He stopped when he came to a drawing, its lines sharp and frantic, the sigil of Vale Kythos. It stared up at him with malignant patience, and he looked away, afraid for a moment of what he might see reflected in its accusing angles. His thoughts drifted, and he found himself recalling another room, another time. The details were different, the ending the same. The presence that followed him, the shadow that walked beside him in this world and the next, it was always the same. His eyes dulled, then flared again with renewed determination. He would not be defeated by this. Not yet. Not while he could still hold on to the shreds of reason in a universe gone mad. The burnt pages crackled like brittle leaves as he moved them aside, his resolve hardening with each brittle movement. He gathered the sheets in a careful pile, stacking them atop the scorched desk. One way or another he would know the truth of what happened here, the truth of what awaited him beyond this broken moment in time. He reached out and placed a steady hand against the burnt wall, feeling the echo of heat long dissipated, the trace of madness still warm. John stood in the center of the ruined study, a solitary figure outlined in the glow of his own terrible insight. The room seemed to draw in around him, its confines pressing closer with a tangible, hostile intent. He turned toward the door, the words "Veil Kythos" and "the Echo" imprinted in his mind as deeply as they had been etched into Dr. Eldritch's. He could feel the weight of them, feel their presence like a second heartbeat, their pulse growing stronger and more certain. The lamplight quivered in the study's dimness, throwing restless shadows across the walls. John felt the room breathe, expanding and contracting with a static hum. It grew around him, a monstrous, suffocating thing, until everything fractured into sharp, overlapping patches. The very fabric of his vision split apart, and he staggered through layers of Arkham's crooked cityscape. Time and place doubled and trebled, warped alleys bleeding into themselves like infected wounds. From the chaos, several figures with John's own face emerged, their mouths working in silent horror. A distorted, echoing dream unfolded around him, and he reached out in vain to stop it. The lamplight's quiver became a violent strobe, breaking the study into flickering frames of existence. John clutched at his head, but the world pushed relentlessly inward, the hum climbing into a piercing whine. The walls pulsed, alive and malignant, and then everything splintered, reality shredding into overlapping planes of sight and sound. John's voice ripped from his throat, silent against the encroaching madness. He staggered through the fissure into Arkham's sprawling, recursive nightmare. The city bent in on itself, layers of its streets and facades twisting like fractured bones. Crooked alleys and grand buildings folded over and over until the familiar became monstrous. He saw himself reflected in every twisted surface, every iteration of John trapped in a private, soundless scream. The figures with his likeness emerged like specters from the jagged geometry, each one reaching out, each one bearing a distinct, tormenting expression. One of them, eyes wide with despair, grasped at his own chest. Another pointed a shaking hand to a collapsing clock tower, its face melting and reforming in an eternal futile loop. John felt the pressure of their presence closing in, smothering him beneath the weight of their shared horror. The whole world shifted, a dizzying merry-go-round of vision and memory, and still the silent, pleading faces of his reflections loomed. They mouthed words that broke into fragments, never whole, always just out of reach. "Veil Kythos!" one seemed to scream, but the name was swallowed by the crushing ambient dissonance. "The Echo!" cried another, but the syllables distorted, warped by the distance between time and place. Everything collapsed inward, the nightmare vision pulling John deeper into its incoherent heart. The figures multiplied, each one an echo of his dread. One emerged from the chaos, older and wearier, its glow an accusing blaze. He saw the eyes, his eyes, unyielding and yet so desperately lost. They swarmed around him, the chorus of his haunted selves closing in like jaws of some spectral beast. The clock tower loomed large in the fractured dreamscape, a mocking anchor in the tempest of disarray. Its hands spun, then slowed, then sped again, a taunting reminder of the futility of time in this endless moment. John's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he reached out toward it, his own hands mirrored by dozens more, each one an extension of the despair that gripped him. Papers from the real, remembered study fluttered around him like confetti from a parade of insanity. The physical and the phantom mingled, indistinguishable from one another in the maelstrom of unreality. He stumbled, his footing lost in the mess of past and present, of what was and what would never be. The hum, the whine, the insistent terrible noise mounted to a crescendo, each sound folding over itself, replicating and distorting, and still the world around him spun, a grotesque carnival ride through madness and identity. John's mind screamed a soundless wail that harmonized with his other selves, their combined despair and aria of the end. He grasped at the air, at the vision, at anything that might hold him steady against the onslaught, but his hands met only empty space and shattered dreams. The clock tower, the city, his very sense of being crumbled into the void. The lamplight's flicker, the breath of the room, his own life, it all unraveled, threads pulled loose by an unseen malicious hand. Then silence thick and suffocating,
John stood alone in the ruined study, the vision retreating but not gone. The words echoed through him, doubling and tripling, filling him with their dreadful promise. Veil Kythos, the echo. They swirled around him, refusing to be silenced. A malignant reminder of what had come, and what was yet to come. He closed his eyes, hoping to shut out the inevitability of it, to hide from the specters that still lingered in his mind's eye. But there was no escaping them now. Not now, not ever. The true nature of the nightmare he had glimpsed left him trembling in its shadow. His breath returned, shallow and uneven, a mockery of relief. The investigation had opened more than it had answered. He opened his eyes again, facing the persistent and terrible unknown. Following Eldritch's last steps, John Harlow walked the quiet hallways of the Arkham Historical Society. Underneath the redolent layers of history and dust, the floorboards shivered beneath him. Each step reverberated. Secrets swam. Whispers spoke of ghosts in the walls. At the back of the main hall, past glass-cased exhibits and wary eyes, he found the passage that led underground. Forgotten or denied by those who could not see, this winding path fell away from the curated facade above and opened onto cold stone floors. The basement loomed around him, cavernous and spare, its silence broken only by the echoes of a hidden purpose. Charred symbols etched into the walls, scattered artifacts like broken corpses. An erratic portal flickered and pulsed at the center, casting grotesque shadows. He moved among the remains of forgotten rites, an unwilling pilgrim in a temple of dust and echoes. His footsteps set time in motion, rippling through the stagnant air. Forgotten or denied by those who could not see, he walked unnoticed by the oblivious world above. The door opened for him, as if he had been expected. It always opened for him. Forgotten, but not gone. The air grew colder as he moved further from the world above. His breath hung like specters on the edge of sight. He was not welcome here, yet he could not leave. The walls seemed to tighten around him. Watching with burnt, hollow eyes, his thoughts lingered on Sarah, the masquerade. The portal's erratic flicker was a mocking light, guiding him deeper into memory. Charred symbols, the walls were covered with them, an illegible history. He read their stories in burnt outlines and haunted silences. A tremor passed through him, recognition tempered with dread. They were like the symbols at Valemont. They were like the symbols in his mind. This room, cavernous and spare, mirrored past horrors with a disturbing precision. It grew with his anticipation, shrunk with his despair. A gaping wound in the orderly facade above, a dislocation. He moved deliberately among the relics, an unwilling pilgrim in a temple of dust and echoes. The low, rhythmic hum of the portal was a pulse beneath his skin. It vibrated in time with his internal fracture, his own uncertainties. The tarnished remains of forgotten rites lay scattered across the floor, burned and broken, a shrine to his failures, a testament to his madness. John's focus sharpened with each step, but so did the chaotic tremors that threatened to unmake him. A dark anticipation overwhelmed him, an inevitability. He felt a familiar, haunting sense of déjà vu, but he could not stop. Not this time. He could not stop the echoes. They called to him from a distance that spanned more than space or time, hummed beneath his skin. He could almost hear her voice. He imagined a different outcome where the past did not haunt him, and the future was not a terrible weight. Burnt and broken artifacts surrounded him like the relics of some monstrous age. A world with a harlequin's laughter clung to his skin like a chill. Still it mocked him. The portal's sporadic glow mirrored the unsettling aura at Valemont, that haunted house of blood and revelry. But it was not the same. His skin, his mind, tingled with its discordant light. His own uncertainties. His thoughts spun in loops, fragments of old words reassembled into symbols he could not decipher. His footsteps set time in motion, rippling through stagnant air. John circled the room, but he did not pace. He calculated each movement with deliberate precision, an inevitability. The relics bore the subtle marks of his sleepless nights, his measured pursuit of truths that might have been better left hidden. The portal's pulse was in time with his own internal fracture, a shiver of light and movement, broken and mad. He imagined a different outcome, where the past did not haunt him, and the future was not a terrible weight. He could almost hear her voice, his past with Sarah and his father. It all waited to swallow him, like it had before. And yet he could not stop. Not this time. He could not stop the echoes. He brushed his fingers over tarnished, forgotten things, but he could not touch them. A haze covered them, though his eyes were clear.
The glow from Vale Kythos lingered, carrying both the eldritch truth and madness of his experiences. The portal flickered with a terrible energy, bending the very air, bending him. Memories of Valemont blurred into one endless, horrific night. He watched as a spectator, the Harlequin's ghostly mirage, the monster's laughing mask, the eldritch horror still mocking him, distorting his reality. It would never stop. His movements carried a gravity that came from seeing too much and understanding too little. The silence was punctuated by the low, rhythmic hum of the portal, compelling him deeper into the chamber as he contemplated the symbols and the foreboding presence they invoked. A fractured future. He could almost hear her voice, his attention fixed on the portal, on the relentless and monstrous inevitability. His thoughts circled endlessly, around the house at Valemont and its unholy mirth, the blurring lines between real and unreal, what he had done and what he could not do. It all waited to swallow him. The portal's pull was overwhelming, like it had before. A man driven to confront his own darkness. He stepped forward. A chaos unfolded in ragged layers, each one darker and more grotesque. John's mind reeled beneath its terrible weight, beneath its terrible truth. The portal's energy consumed him, thrusting him into the past. The scenes were fast, violent, absurd. Nithalcor's face grinning with cruel malice, his father's face dissolving into ghostly smoke, Sarah's face, her expression lost to the moment of her death. His consciousness struggled against the flood, against the maddening distortion. His presence collapsed within itself, leaving only awareness, only a monster, only the echo. The flood of memories did not relent, did not give him time to process or grieve. Each fragment hit him like a pulse of violence, of cruelty. The monster's laughing mask, the Harlequin's ghostly mirage, Sarah on the floor lifeless, his father on the floor gone. A reality that shifted like smoke, changing with each heartbeat, each tortured scream. John's body moved with the chaos, recoiling with every breath. His skin tingled with electric madness. His mind struggled against the fractured scenes that crashed and folded in on themselves. He was everywhere at once, nowhere at once. The visions overwhelmed him, absorbed him, ripped apart all sense of time, and still the horror grew. An explosion, a sound, the absence of sound, then Nithalcor, his face a sneer of malice, his features stretched and blurred, cartoon-like, laughing as reality dissolved around him. Each horrific memory unfurled, broken, twisted. The low hum of the portal was now a scream, a madness, an unending torrent. His father vanished into smoke, a broken doll, a child's cry. John was a ghost within the visions, watching himself from outside himself, a phantom within a phantom. He was outside time, outside reason, yet he saw it all, he felt it all. Every distortion, every nightmare, every impossibility ripping apart, collapsing. His body jolted with the memories' every wound, his mind drowned in its flood. John's awareness seemed to stretch, tear, and pull apart as he lost all sense of time and place. The scenes sped up, disjointed, a frantic motion of fractured, searing pain. Nithalcor's face, a cruel blur of arrogance, then gone. Then there, his father's voice, the Harlequin's laugh, and a monstrous choir of screams. A body on the floor, two bodies on the floor. He was nowhere, and everywhere, and nowhere again. The horror surrounded him, became him. The portal's relentless chaos aided him, bled him dry. The shifting unreality of Valemont became all reality. His senses burst, swelled, and ruptured. Repeated conversations that had not yet occurred, events he did not want to know, truths he had denied. Time lost meaning, as did sanity, as did anything but horror. A grotesque symphony of loss repeated over and over, each repetition worse than the last, each repetition collapsing under the weight of itself. The scenes ripped into absurd fragments, torn pieces of flesh and blood. He watched himself unravel with terrible, precise slowness. He felt himself unravel with terrible, mad speed. Each distortion, every nightmare, every impossibility ripping apart. His body jolted with memory's every wound, his mind drowned in its flood. His sister's death seen from a dozen perspectives, lost to a moment of chaos and unending distortion, each repetition collapsing under the weight of itself. Then the Harlequin speaking to him in riddles he could not understand,
a spectral figure emerging with a terrible familiarity. It was fluid, smoke-like, out of focus. It moved with a haunting precision, each motion disturbing the natural order. John's eyes locked on its presence. Recognition. The creature's shifting mask bore uncanny resemblances. Ghosts of his past, ghosts of his failure, ghosts he had become. The ghost he had become, the ghost he would become. The monstrous figure froze the moment, froze him. Echoes, whispers, memories, shadows. It emerged from the flood, the echo, mirroring his every move, each mask more familiar, more haunting than the last. It watched him with an unsettling, fractured intelligence, a parasite feeding on time, feeding on him. John's mind reeled beneath its terrible weight, beneath its terrible truth. The chaos continued, relentless, a terrible history, an inevitable collapse. Every repetition worse than the last, more horrifying than the last. He could not move, could not breathe, yet he moved and breathed and lived each horror as it struck him. He could not escape. John stood immobilized, a terrible sense of recognition washing over him. The monster mirrored his presence with precision. His voice, Sarah's voice, the Harlequin's laugh, each one darker and more grotesque, each one terrible truth. The portal's energy consumed him, thrusting him into the past. Every fragment hit him like a pulse of violence and cruelty. A reality that shifted in smoke, changing with each heartbeat, each tortured scream. His mind struggled against the fractured scenes. He was everywhere at once. The visions overwhelmed him, and still the horror grew. The visions closed in on John, memories made flesh and shadow. They screamed at him, with him, through him. A past he could not forget, a future he did not want. The echo was a monster. It was John. The creature was him, articulating disjointed phrases from John's life and thoughts, everything he had tried to deny, everything he had feared. Every event was seen and felt. Nothing escaped him. His own chaotic collapse reflected in his eyes, in the echo's haunting, shifting mask, in a mask that was his face. It blurred in and out of recognition. John saw himself, lost himself, became himself. The fractured memories collapsed, leaving John alone with the creature. He could not look away, he could not remember, yet he remembered, more than he wanted, too much. The laughter, the scream, the absence of sound. He was all of them. His consciousness struggled against the flood, against the maddening distortion. His presence collapsed within itself, leaving only awareness, only a monster, only the echo. The narrow, dimly lit chamber breathed with oppressive familiarity, its soot-stained walls crumbling beneath the weight of memory. Scorched symbols traced an arcane language across the surface, pulsing with spectral heat that refused to die. John stepped inside, and the trembling half-light greeted him like an old lover. He held her ghostly form in his gaze as she emerged from the swirling shadows of a warped mirror, and her silent eyes carried him back to her final moments. He stood rigid, clenching his fists as the room shivered with unstable energy, each heartbeat an echo of torment and refusal. The apparition of his lost sister lingered with a fading smile, and his voice broke the stillness. "I must face this pain." The walls pressed inward with palpable malevolence. John felt their jagged decay in his bones. He let his eyes trace their crumbling surfaces, following the chaotic web of hairline cracks and scorched residue. Each break seemed a raw wound, bleeding the chamber's despair into his mind. Beneath his feet, the floor lay littered with ash, fine as dust and older than memory. He walked further inside, his measured steps raising spectral clouds that danced in the faint, flickering glow. Arcane symbols seared into the walls drew John's focus, their fiery outlines casting grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe. Their presence was unsettling, a lingering stain of failed incantations or forbidden rites. He felt the pull of their cryptic meanings, each stroke imbued with unnatural energy. The air around them warped and shivering. They pulsed as if alive, sentient with unspeakable intent, and he moved through their embrace like a man in chains, bound by something far older than himself. At the heart of the chamber stood a warped mirror, its surface mottled with the echoes of long-faded reflections. The glass bulged and swirled like water, unable to hold its shape or sanity. John's eyes locked onto its depths, and there a form began to coalesce, her spectral image unfurled from the chaos, delicate and agonizing in its silence. His breath caught as she took shape,
he had dreaded and longed to see. His sister, lost to him yet forever present in this haunted reflection. He could not look away as she emerged, translucent and insistent. Her outline wavered at the edges, shifting with the same fragile instability that plagued the room. John's mind strained against the flood of the memory, the old anguish cracking open with surgical precision. He watched her eyes wide and knowing, and felt the wound of her absence freshly carved into his heart. She did not speak, yet her gaze said everything. "I must face this pain," John repeated, the words a litany against despair. He swallowed hard, tasting ash and regret. The mirror trembled, its glass straining to hold her image. He took a halting step closer, his body rigid with the weight of unspoken apologies. "I am sorry," he said, his voice as fragile as her flickering form. The chamber held its breath, as if waiting to see him shatter. Her spectral smile faded, a soft, relentless accusation. It was a smile he remembered, tender and resigned, the same one that had lingered in his mind since the day she died. That moment, forever suspended in cruel clarity, unfolded before him. He saw her in those final hours, her life slipping away as he fought to save her. The realization of his failure hit him with merciless accuracy, cutting through the years to lay him bare. Nearby, a presence stirred, drawing John's attention from the bleeding wound of his memory. The echo hovered like a shadow, its form restless and liquid. He watched as it twisted and unfurled, mimicking his sister's sorrow with disturbing elegance. Its ever-shifting mask settled briefly into her likeness, then shifted again, distorting her pain through subtle, malevolent echoes. "You," John's voice faltered, an accusing whisper. "Even now you taunt me." The echo shimmered, its outline fluid and mocking. It mirrored his torment back at him, refracting it into an endless hall of misery. Her face, its own face, the face of every fear he had ever known, every grief left raw and bleeding. The room closed tighter, pressing against John's resistance. He felt the energy swirl, unstable and suffocating, each pulse in time with his racing heart. The arcane symbols throbbed, their light cruel and conspiratorial. With each step he took, the space around him grew more oppressive, thickening with the density of emotion left unspoken for too long. The apparition of his sister lingered, eyes wide and accusing, a martyr to his regrets. The air grew heavy, choking on his past failures and the thick smoke of the chamber's ruined atmosphere. John's fists clenched, whitening with tension. The echo's presence stoked his fear, reflecting the scars he could not hide, could not erase. "You wanted me to see this," John accused, his words both accusation and admission. "But I will face it." His determination hung in the air like a fragile bridge, a lifeline to the reality he had not yet lost. His sister's form quivered, her silence louder than any condemnation. John moved towards her, driven by a need to make amends, to speak what was left to say. His footsteps were leaden, each one a defiance of gravity and grief. He felt the sting of her final moments, as if living it anew, an eternal instant of helplessness and despair. The echo's voice layered his own, a chorus of whispers, an uncanny imitation. "Face this pain, this," it reverberated, each repetition a needle in his resolve. The room pulsed with temporal irregularities, the warped mirror straining under the weight of reality's demands. "I will face this," John insisted, louder this time, his voice challenging the echo, the memory, the fragile truth of her presence. He reached the mirror, the world bending around him, and her image met him with one last damning look. He choked on her name, but the air was too thick with sorrow. The moment of her passing consumed him, wrapping his soul in cold finality. His heart stuttered, crushed beneath the timeless burden, and for one infinite second he thought he might disappear. The echo embraced him in its spectral chorus, his voice, her voice, their voice. He stood alone, shaking in the void of her absence. The corridor stretched before John like a narrow artery, dark and haunted with fading history. His steps were muffled, swallowed by the thick air and silence that lived between each heartbeat. Walls closed in, claustrophobic and stained with memories he could not outrun. Shattered portraits stared with blind accusation, while faded family crests bore witness to sins that refused to die. The air thickened, pressing around him like water in the lungs. The long, dark passage was a needle piercing John's resolve. Its narrow walls converged on him, constricting with each step. He moved as if through a tomb, his shadow a thin whisper against the dim plaster. The weight of the air pushed back against his advance, urging him to retreat, but he pressed onward, driven by a need he could not name. The further he walked, the further the corridor seemed to stretch, a cruel, elastic mockery of distance and time. Along the walls, broken frames held portraits of those who had come before him, each face an indictment of legacy and loss. Their glass was shattered, like the lives they depicted, splintered and cold. John's eyes brushed over them, unable to linger, unable to forget. Family crests, once proud, now faded and defeated, lay buried in layers of dust and neglect. He felt their gaze, empty and accusing, searing his skin with blame he had carried too long. The air grew denser, pregnant with expectation and foreboding. John drew a breath and found it heavy with the smell of decay, of history rotting from within. He faltered for a moment, the passage ahead dissolving into shadow and uncertainty, but he steadied himself, unwilling to be turned back by ghosts of the past, by the thick, cloying vapors of what might have been. His pulse quickened, each beat a syncopated hammer in the waiting silence. Halfway down the corridor, John stopped, his instincts sharper than sight or reason. Something was there at the edge of perception. A figure, spectral and fragile, manifested at the far end. His father. John's eyes widened as the shape flickered in and out, an old film struggling to remain on the reel. The recognition sliced through him, equal parts agony and need. The apparition burned with a clarity he could not understand, the clarity of fear realized and reproach confirmed. John's posture stiffened, his every muscle taut with dread and yearning. He heard his breath, ragged in the growing dark, a counterpoint to the aching stillness. The ghostly image lingered at the edge of sight, holding itself just out of reach, taunting him with its half-real nature. Every unresolved longing, every scrap of bitterness he thought buried, surfaced to assault him. "Why did you abandon me?" The question tore from John's throat, a strangled plea echoing in the narrow space. His voice reverberated off decaying plaster, folding back on itself in hollow, mocking tones. A chuckle answered, low and distorted, a chorus of derision. The echo had not left him. It stretched and rippled in the air, like the unanswered prayers of his youth, and its mask wore an amused twist, a parody of his father's unyielding expression. It multiplied John's question, scattering it with cruel, surgical finesse. "Abandon me, abandon." The fractured refrain mocked, turning pain into farce. John flinched, the echo consuming his thoughts, the apparition consuming his will. Each time his father's image faltered, the brief absence crushed him with its emptiness. He moved forward on leaden legs, compelled by the need to confront, to resolve what had never been finished. Each step was an eternity, each flicker a rebirth of anguish. The atmosphere conspired against him, compressing with relentless precision. The walls loomed closer, threatening to meet and swallow him whole. He thought of the shattered glass, the dead eyes in their ruined frames, the abandoned crests that bore witness. Every surface seemed to hum with the vibration of his despair. "Why?" he called again, desperation fusing with anger, with longing, with love unrequited. His voice cracked, bleeding his spirit into the surrounding dark. "Why did you—" But the sentence dissolved, unfinished into the waiting shadows. The echo laughed, a dissonant melody that shamed him, that exposed his deepest wounds to a universe too cruel to care. It played with his words, stretching them across timelines, distorting their meaning until nothing was left but grief. The specter remained, flickering, tormenting. It held the shape of his father's disdain, the substance of his father's absence. John reached towards it, his fingers splayed against the press of reality, against the refusal of time to heal. The closer he drew, the brighter the edges of reality glowed. He felt the instability in his marrow, each step a painful resurrection of the past.
He moved as if underwater, as if each inch were a betrayal of distance itself. The room swayed with unreality, with movements collapsing in on themselves, threatening to take him with them. John's soul vibrated in symphony with the breaking world, with his breaking heart. He called again, his voice a dry husk in the dead air. Why? The question repeated, echoed, splitting in time and in two. The image trembled like the rest of his life, insubstantial and disappearing. John reached it, his body a dull ache of determination, his spirit unraveling with each moment that it did not turn, did not answer. Why? He did not know if he was shouting or whispering, or if it was simply his voice singing in tandem with the echo, with the air, with the universe. The spectral form held him in its silent condemnation. The flickering brightness swallowed them both. The study was cluttered with remnants of forbidden rituals, each artifact a ghost of reckless ambition. John moved through the space like a penitent, the dust rising to greet him with the weight of old sins. Shelved groaned beneath tomes that had stolen lifetimes, their pages scorched and crumbling in accusation. Intricate symbols were burned into a scarred desk, a testament to power grasped and lost. Broken vials littered the floor, evidence of past failures he could no longer deny. Each step was measured, each breath a confrontation with his own inner corruption. The room held its secrets tightly, oppressive and unyielding. John felt the echoes of his past in every corner, in every relic that bore his careless signature. He walked among them, a pilgrim seeking redemption, his figure shadowed and heavy. The air itself resisted, pressing against him with the weight of countless missteps, of a history unrepentant. John's gaze fell on the dusty tomes lining the shelves, their spines cracked with age and neglect. They sagged under the burden of forgotten knowledge, of truths too dangerous to wield. He reached out to touch one, then drew back, as if the contact would burn him with the fire of unlearned lessons. The books seemed to watch him, their scorched pages whispering accusations, accusing him of what he had become, of what he had dared to seek. The desk bore similar witness to his past. Its surface was marred with symbols, each one an intricate web of desire and despair. They were burned deep, branding the wood with his once insatiable hunger for power. John traced their lines with his eyes, seeing now the cost of every stroke, the scars left on wood and soul alike. His footsteps crunched on broken glass, the shards of vials that had promised too much and delivered too little. They lay scattered like the wreckage of hope, glittering in the dim light with the sharpness of bitter memory. John stepped around them, careful not to disturb what needed no further disturbance. They were fragments of his hubris, of the experiments that had failed him, of the time that had refused to be tamed. The study's atmosphere grew denser, a silent accusation hanging heavy in the air. John felt its thickness in his lungs, its reproach in his bones. The room was alive with the specters of his ambition, each artifact a reminder of paths not taken, and of those taken all too willingly. He paused, letting the full weight of his past press upon him, and wondered if this was the history he was doomed to repeat. A shifting movement drew his attention, a presence that rippled like disturbed water. The echo hovered with fluid precision, its form taking on the corrupted reflection of John himself. It wore his face, his flaws, his ambition twisted and magnified into something alien and wrong. John watched as it morphed, the features subtly distorted, a gross parody of his own dark nature. Its mask flickered through 1,000 variations, each one a jab at his carefully guarded self-image. The echo knew him too well, and it played on that knowledge with disturbing grace. "Am I healing these timelines or binding myself further?" John murmured, his voice tinged with grim doubt. The words fell like stones, heavy and cold, shattering the silence that engulfed him. He stood still, his shadowed figure outlined by the taunting mercurial presence. The echo responded without words, its shifting form a testament to his inner turmoil. It danced around him, reflecting his uncertainty, his fears of failure, of success, of every possible outcome he could not foresee. It was the ultimate mirror, the one he most dreaded, the one he could not avoid. The air cracked with tension, the very fabric of reality quivering in response to John's internal conflict. He felt it in every breath, in every tremor of the floor beneath his feet. It was the price of his ambition, the cost of seeking what should not be found. The weight was immense, and it bore down on him with relentless ferocity. But John was not ready to surrender. He set his jaw, his eyes glowing with defiance, with eldritch resolve. The echo watched, curious, as he drew a slow, measured breath. John reached into the depths of himself, to the knowledge he had gained, to the lessons learned at the edge of sanity. He began to murmur, his voice a thread of sound weaving through the tense air. The words formed a counter-incantation, a chant against the darkness within and without. His tone grew stronger, edged with determination, with the will to overcome. The study reacted with violence, the symbols on the desk flaring to life. The unstable reality shuddered, sending pulses through the room, through John's resolve, through the very essence of time itself. Shelves shook and glass vials rattled, the remnants of his past agitated by his newfound intent. The echo flickered, its form struggling to maintain cohesion, to hold its mocking shape. John's voice rose, a crescendo of resolve that filled the space, filled the fractures in his spirit. The oppressive air thinned, unable to bear the weight of his determination. John's final words echoed through the study, vibrating in harmony with the flickering universe. The spectral form quivered, then burst into nothingness, a fragile victory marked by silence and hope. He stood alone, shaking but unbroken, the dust of old sins settling around him. John crossed into the temporal rift. It yawned around him with jagged hunger. The air felt fractured, ruptured by a primal wound that split it into splinters of unstable shadow and echo. Time shivered and bled together, distorting perception in chaotic eddies, yet he saw the scholar clearly. Samuel Eldritch. He huddled within the maelstrom, muttering at the visions that entangled him like barbed wire. His eyes flickered over ghastly images, a future ruled by veiled Mythos where broken timelines dissolved into despair. The scholar seemed unaware of the investigator's presence, caught in a relentless loop, part of the dreadful architecture that enclosed them both. John stepped forward, the fractured ground crackling beneath his feet like brittle bones. Each movement sent ripples through the wounded air, shadows twisting into grotesque shapes before dissolving. His eyes glowed with an eldritch light, piercing through the murk and chaos, guiding him towards his quarry. It was as if the space itself rebelled against his presence, reshaping with a cruel intelligence, yet he pressed on, undeterred by the dizzying distortions. The entire rift felt alive, pulsing with malice, but John moved with grim determination, his senses straining to make sense of the disjointed environment that threatened to swallow him whole. He caught glimpses of past, present, and future entangled in spectral webs, each image a fragment of unfolding catastrophe. But it was the scholar, Samuel Eldritch, that anchored him amidst the chaos. John's voice cut through the cacophony like a lifeline. "Eldritch!" he called, his voice stretching across timelines, distorted by echoes but still reaching their target. The scholar remained crouched within the swirl, enmeshed in a loop of unending fixation. Around him, relics from doomed realities blinked in and out of existence, their collapsing forms casting a lurid, intermittent glow. "Eldritch!" John repeated, his tone sharpening with urgency. At last, the scholar's head jerked up, his eyes darting through the disarray until they settled on John's familiar form. The recognition seemed to jolt Eldritch, a sudden awareness cutting through the shroud of his obsession. For a moment he stared blankly, as if seeing a ghost. Then the fixation returned, pulling at him with insidious strength. John's presence was an anomaly within an anomaly, and Eldritch's mind struggled to reconcile it. His mouth moved, forming words that barely rose above a whisper, only to be snatched away by the ravenous air. So many futures, he gasped, his voice cracking under the weight of what he'd seen. John moved closer, the relentless churn of reality testing his every step. He reached for Eldritch with a steady hand, his touch a rare point of contact in the sea of distortion. "You don't have to do this alone," John said, his words heavy with meaning. He knew the price of knowledge all too well, the cost of staring into the abyss and seeing it stare back. "We've faced this before. We can face it again." Eldritch's eyes locked onto John's, a glimmer of desperate hope fighting against the shadows of dread. But the visions clawed at him, demanding attention. He turned back to the flickering horrors that surrounded them, his voice rising in frantic incantation. Names of ancient entities spilled from his lips, threads of doomed possibilities interwoven with cries of despair. Veiled Mythos loomed over it all, a presence both monstrous and inevitable. John felt the pull of that dark name, its resonance a chilling reminder of the power they faced. With a firm grip, John shook Eldritch's shoulder, forcing him to focus. The contact broke through the spiral of terror,
grounding the scholar in the fragile present. "Listen to me, Eldritch," John insisted, his voice cutting through the din with surgical precision. "This isn't the end. Not yet." Eldritch blinked rapidly, as if waking from a nightmare that refused to let go. The loop of visions loosened its hold, and for a moment clarity returned. He sagged against John's presence, his body trembling with exhaustion and revelation. I thought I was alone," he admitted, the admission both a confession and a plea. "You were never alone," John replied, his tone firm yet laced with understanding. "Now let's get out of here before it collapses." Together they turned away from the maddening swirl, their steps gaining strength as they moved toward a future still unwritten. But the specter of Vale Kythos lingered in their wake, a chilling echo of what lay ahead. Papers swirled like wounded birds around John and Eldritch, a storm of fractured thought and disarray. The warped floor tilted beneath them, distorting lines and reason. They knelt amid the littered ruins, speaking in tones of hushed determination, voices edged with desperation. Arcane symbols, broken in bleeding ink, lay scattered like accusations at their feet. They worked in unison, a choreography of frenzied grace, their hands dancing over scorched manuscripts and charred artifacts. Each syllable of the incantation fell like a stone into dark water, rippling with unstable energy, binding the tumult to their will. In the heart of the storm they were methodical, movements precise despite the chaos that threatened to engulf them. They arranged relics and fragments with practiced efficiency, their minds honed to a single purpose. John's eyes shone with that uncanny light, cutting through the haze, focusing on the arcane configurations they hastily assembled. Eldritch moved with equal urgency, his academic composure fraying at the edges but holding firm. The environment seemed to conspire against them, an unstable maze of shifting angles and twisted space, yet they persisted, driven by the necessity to act, to contain the nightmare that loomed over reality itself. "We need to stabilize it," John said, his voice a calm anchor amid the turmoil. His fingers traced the edges of a scorched manuscript, aligning it with precision. "These must be placed before we start." Eldritch nodded, his face a mask of intense concentration. He grabbed a charred artifact, its surface etched with dark, indecipherable markings. "The energy conduits," he replied, almost to himself. "We have to use the artifacts as conduits." He placed it carefully, each action carrying the weight of consequence. Their plan unfolded in terse, urgent exchanges, a language of shared desperation. Every item, every word was part of a precarious balance, a gamble against overwhelming odds. The stakes were painfully clear. Failure meant not just death, but the unraveling of everything they knew. The presence of Vale Kythos hung over them, a shadow of dark inevitability, but they worked with the resolve of those who have nothing left to lose, binding themselves to the fragile hope that they could succeed. The incantations began as whispers, woven into the fabric of their movements. They grew louder, more insistent, shaping the chaos around them into a semblance of order. John and Eldritch's voices resonated into low, rhythmic chants, the words vibrating with arcane power. They repeated the phrases with a desperate harmony, their bodies moving in sync with the syllables. The unstable forces trembled at their touch, both dangerous and malleable. They were binding demons to chains of language, shackling uncertainty with spoken will. The space responded to their ritual, convulsing with the strain of containment. The ground shook beneath them, each tremor a reminder of the power they sought to control. John's face was a study of grim determination, his jaw set against the odds. Eldritch showed the strain more visibly, sweat beading on his forehead, but his resolve remained unbroken. Together they pushed against the tide, their actions a defiance of cosmic proportions. "Hold it steady," John called out, his voice barely audible above the tumult. His hands moved with deliberate speed, shifting a critical piece into place. The fractured reality seemed to fight back, lashing out with violent bursts of energy. Eldritch clenched his teeth, adjusting a symbol that had begun to slip. "We can do this," he said, his voice filled with conviction that bordered on madness. The air around them crackled with a raw potential, threatening to ignite. But they continued, defying the limitations of both body and mind, pushing the ritual to its breaking point. The environment heaved with resistance, but the binds began to take hold, the unthinkable forces bending to their will. The chaos that had enveloped them now centered, drawn into the focal point of their design. John and Eldritch moved faster, their actions blurring into a single desperate effort. It was an act of sheer will, a fight against the collapse of everything. In those final moments, the space contracted violently, a beast struggling against its chains. The very air seemed to scream with the pressure of containment, but the pattern held. John's eyes met Eldritch's, a shared look of defiant hope as the last syllables fell. The ritual took root, a seed of stability in the field of chaos, leaving them breathless and alive with possibility. The ritual neared its zenith and the space convulsed with apocalyptic fury. Reality folded upon itself, collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane, pulling multiple timelines into a monstrous nexus. John and Eldritch stood at the eye of the storm, besieged by its terrible beauty, and the anomaly writhed as if alive. Eldritch's eyes met John's in a moment of raw understanding, a choice made without words. He turned toward the chaos, his resolve written in every line of his face, and let it consume him. A final gesture of sacrifice, redirecting the raging energy into itself. John was hurled away by the explosion, thrown through the dying portal and into the cold, dim halls of Arkham. His body lay battered, his mind shadowed by what he had witnessed, but the echo of Eldritch's choice lingered, a spectral reminder that their battle with Vale Kythos was not yet over. He lay there, the cold silence of the old building enveloping him, stark against the memory of tumult and light. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, indifferent to the violence that had just transpired. John's vision wavered, the afterimage of the Nexus burned into his eyes, a haunting residue of intersecting worlds. The corridors stretched out in eerie quiet, the everyday gloom a stark contrast to the catastrophic beauty he'd left behind. John pulled himself up, his body protesting each movement with the sharp reminders of the physical toll, but the deeper wounds lay elsewhere, embedded in thought and conscience. Eldritch's choice replayed in his mind, an endless loop of self-sacrifice that he struggled to accept. John's eyes flickered with that strange light, now subdued, casting fractured shadows that seemed to echo the unresolved tension within him. "What have you done?" he whispered to the empty hall, the question as much for himself as for the absent scholar. He felt the weight of Eldritch's final act, a burden both mournful and profound. John's steps were unsteady as he moved through the familiar but now alien space of Arkham. Each footfall was an attempt to ground himself in this reality, to make sense of the one he had left behind. The influence of Vale Kythos lingered like a dark promise, the entity's reach extending beyond the scholar's sacrifice. John knew the battle was far from over, that the entity's shadow stretched across more than just one world. But the echo of Eldritch's choice resonated deeply, a reminder of the resolve that had not died with him. John paused, listening to the silence that enveloped him. It was vast and hollow, a haunting void that refused to answer the questions it raised. But within that silence was the ghost of Eldritch's defiance, a whispered vow that even Vale Kythos could not entirely smother. John squared his shoulders, determination hardening through the ache of loss. Their struggle continued, a battle played out across timelines and fates, but it was not one that he would face alone. The shadows stretched long as he walked, his resolve casting them into shapes of strange, resilient hope. The shadows gathered, thick and expectant, around the dim room where John sat alone. His presence was the only thing breathing life into the airless void, yet he moved with the grace of a specter. At his ancient oak desk he unfolded a brittle, handwritten note, holding the fragile paper with fingers that trembled and betrayed a sorrow deeply suppressed. All around him the relics of past investigations lay as if in mourning. The faded photographs, the creased maps, the cracked spine of a familiar tome, each whispering their own lament. But John's eyes fixed on one image in particular, a small framed portrait of Dr. Samuel Eldritch. As he gazed upon it, his intense eyes narrowed, and the room seemed to lean in with bated breath. A candle flickered erratically on the desk, casting an eldritch glow that gave life to the elongated shadows dancing on the cracked, time-worn wallpaper. The note crinkled softly as he opened it further, the paper's brittleness threatening to shatter like old bones. Each letter scrawled by Dr. Eldritch's hand seemed to pulse with the weight of unspeakable knowledge. John's eyes moved across the page, but it was as though he read not with sight alone. He felt the familiar burden settle deeper into his soul, pressing down with the force of his suppressed grief. Though the room was silent, the echoes of past voices lingered like unwelcome guests, filling the empty space with their silent accusations. His fingers trembled again, a subtle admission of his tormented state. His gaze returned to the portrait of Eldritch. The face of his old companion stared back at him with an unsettling mixture of wisdom and accusation, as though aware of the perilous journey they had once undertaken. John's mind waded through the murky waters of memory, dredging up the image of Dr. Eldridge's fervent dedication and the steep cost of his pursuits. The flame of the candle threw shadows that seemed to writhe in time with his thoughts, painting an ominous mural of what had been lost. Recent sacrifices gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, refusing to fade into the background. John's hands moved with a mechanical precision, arranging documents and mementos on the desk. The dim room closed in on him, each corner thick with the substance of regret. It was a prison he had built from the fragments of his own past, where every breath was tainted by the knowledge of what he could not reclaim. John's eyes lingered on a frayed and ancient map pinned to the wall, its ink lines bleeding into the yellowed paper like the remnants of a faded memory. The map's unsteady contours spoke of journeys both literal and figurative, their paths converging on a single, haunting point that mirrored the emptiness of his heart. His attention returned to the note. Dr. Eldridge's final words seemed to crawl across the page, each sentence a twisted thread in the fabric of their shared fate. The weight of the paper grew unbearable, and he placed it atop the pile of assembled memories where it lay like an epitaph for what was yet to come. Despite the encroaching darkness, John's movements remained steady, each deliberate action a testament to his resolve. He stood slowly, the room groaning under the strain of his solitary existence. The flickering candle continued its erratic dance, casting grotesque shadows that elongated and distorted with each passing second. Yet within the tumult there was a rhythm, a slow, steady pulse that mirrored John's unyielding heart. The sense of oppression grew, yet John remained unmoved by fear. Instead, he was driven by an inexorable pull toward the truth, no matter the cost. He reached for a familiar coat draped over the back of a weathered chair, its fabric as worn and resolute as he. The haunting atmosphere closed around him like a lover's embrace, promising both comfort and torment. But John was ready. The candle wavered, a final gesture of defiance against the looming dark, and then fell still. His eyes reflected the eldritch light, an unholy glow that spoke of past sins and future trials. Alone in the suffocating silence, John embraced the solitude with open arms, his determination unbroken by the haunting reminders of all he had lost. And as the oppressive quiet deepened, he knew with unwavering certainty that he would not be alone for long. The quiet expanded like a living thing, filling the room with an oppressive hush that wrapped itself around John's thoughts. Then came the laughter, a soft and mocking echo that ricocheted off the bare walls and sliced through the silence with surgical precision.